Hello, fellow traveler. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we journey to a time when ambition ruled as fiercely as kings. Only a few names echo through time like his. More than 2,000 years later, Caesar still stands, a symbol of genius, ambition, and the dangerous beauty of power. So settle in, breathe slow, and listen as the empire begins to stir. Chapter 1. Debt, Danger, and a Name. He stood before dawn in a small courtyard off the Sabura hill. The stones were damp from night air, and a thin mist clung to the figs. He held his breath as a runner passed the alley mouth, sandals loud on the worn steps. In Rome, the wrong footfall at the wrong hour could change everything. He was not yet the man the world would know. He was Gaius Julius Caesar, tall, lean, a patrician by name but not by wealth. The Julian clan traced its line to Aeneas in old stories, but the house on the Esquiline showed the truth. Old fame, thin walls, and careful meals. His mother, Aurelia, guarded the money jar. His father died early, leaving little more than a good name and expectations. That was Rome in his bones. Honor without cushion. Anchors mattered in Rome, and he had one. His aunt, Julia, had married Gaius Marius, 6-time consul and hero against northern tribes. Marius shaped the army and the city's pride. The tie raised Caesar's profile early, but it also painted a target when politics turned rough. Alliances were roads. They led forward, but they also led enemies to your door. By 88 BCE, the old balance had cracked. Marius and his rival, Sulla, split the city into camps, tribunes and nobles, city poor, and countryside wealth. Streets shook with news, and rumors traveled faster than carts. Caesar absorbed it all. He learned to look past a speech and track the hands that counted votes. He saw how money moved, how favors stuck, how fear worked. He watched, and he remembered names. He married Cornelia in 84 BCE, daughter of Lucius Cinna, a strong ally of Marius. The match pleased one side of Rome and provoked the other. It also gave Caesar a small dowry, some friends, and more risk. He wore simple wool and kept his head high at the forum, an image that helped him gather clients, young men who followed a promising patron. Cornelia's house kept its lamps low at night. The city felt unsettled, even on quiet days. A priesthood came soon after, Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter. It was an office wrapped with rules. The priest could not sleep outside Rome, ride a horse, or touch metal. The honor was bright, but its web was tight. Caesar accepted because the appointment came through his allies, and because the title lifted him above the crowd. He had not yet learned how hard it was to shed a sacred chain. The storm then broke. In 82 BCE, Sulla returned from Eastern War and seized Rome. Proscriptions followed. Lists posted in the forum naming enemies of the state. The ink carried death. Men vanished into alleys. Houses closed their shutters. Slaves whispered. Caesar, 20 years old and married to Cinna's daughter, stood exposed. His priesthood, his family, and his name pulled him toward the line where law ended and knives began. Sulla demanded a clean break. He ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia, simple words, brutal force. Caesar refused. It was pride, love, politics. No one could tell which weighed more in his chest. Refusal cost him the priesthood and his wife's dowry. It also put a price on his head. He slipped from one safe house to another. He learned the taste of stale bread and the feel of a damp floor. He learned how the city breathed when the patrols turned a corner. Nights blurred. He counted coins and favors. A friend of a friend arranged a guard unit's restive centurion to look away. A cousin's client carried messages through market crowds with a basket of olives. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred guardians, interceded with Sulla for mercy, as did influential old men who thought the youth could be spared. Caesar waited and moved again, then again. The city sounded different when you were hunted. Every dog's bark was a knife's hint. The pardon came like weak light through cloud. Sulla relented. Some said out of pity, others said because too many allies asked. A line survived from that decision. Sulla warned that many Mariuses dwelled in Caesar. It might be legend, or a memory sharpened by later years. Either way, it clung to him. A reprieve was not safety. It was a narrow bridge. He left Rome, first quiet, then faster. He needed distance and a legal path back to public life. Military service offered both. Asia Minor lay across the Adriatic, a strip of shore and inland hills ruled by Rome through governors and legates. Caesar joined a staff there, a young noble learning war, as if it were a language. The sea crossing was rough. Salt clung to his cloak. Gulls marked the headlands. He felt his body ease as the city's dust fell away. Service opened his senses. He watched veterans build camps with math-like speed, ditches cut to a measured depth, palisade stakes angled for strength. He studied marching order. Light troops ahead, baggage tight, scouts wide on the flanks. He learned to read terrain for water and ambush. He kept his face calm in councils, but studied each officer's tone and pride. The army was a machine that ran on grain, grit, and small honors. He liked its clarity. Facts followed him even in the field. Rome's chain of command tied him to duties that could lead to a quaestorship, the first step on the ladder of offices, the cursus honorum. He needed standing and money for that climb. A provincial post paid modestly, but a commander's approval opened doors. Caesar understood this at once. He carried out orders with speed and took on extra tasks. He collected names again, quartermasters, grain brokers, local leaders along river towns. He was building a map in his head, line by line. The news from Rome gathered into short, sharp reports. Sulla's settlements, land grants to veterans, quiet trials, and small riots. The Republic had survived the storm, at least for now. Rome often did. Caesar measured his steps against that timeline. He chose patience, not because he lacked ambition, but because he felt the edges of the rules and saw where they could bend. Waiting was a tool. He would use it. One winter, a minor action near the Aegean coast tested his nerve. Roman forces supported a local ally against hill raiders who moved fast and struck supply lines. The land smelled of wet pine. The ground held the day's chill into night. Caesar's unit guarded engineers as they repaired a bridge. A sudden arrow hissed from a ridge. He flinched, then steadied. He sent 2 squads up the slope, one visible, one lower in scrub, while he held the line at the abutment. The raiders bit at the bait and broke. It was not a grand battle. It was a small thing done well. Small things mattered. Word of a steady young officer traveled fast in tight circles. He received a civic crown, a wreath of oak leaves, for saving a citizen's life in action. The award granted the right to wear the wreath at public events and to sit with the Senate during triumphs. It was a symbol that told a longer story. He had faced danger and held. He also learned the cost of glory. Hot weather brought fever. A tight march tore a ligament. Debts did not pay themselves. Letters from his mother mixed family news with firm counsel. Keep allies, watch the money, keep your name clean. Aurelia's voice, even on thin papyrus, steadied him. He would need that steadying later when he picked larger risks. It began here, in the careful use of gains, the thin edge between boldness and ruin. By 78 BCE, Sulla resigned his dictatorship and retired to private life. He died soon after. The news unlocked a door. Caesar judged the moment safe enough to return. Rome called to him, its courts, its crowds, its fierce ladder of office. He carried with him a soldier's poise and a record he could show to patrons. He also carried the habits formed under fear: move early, move light, guard your flanks. He stepped back into a city that had changed in small ways. Veterans held new farms in Italy, and some had come to Rome with claims and grievances. Laws from Sulla's reforms had clipped the tribune's power and strengthened the Senate's control, at least on paper. The Forum stones held the memory of lists and blood. Caesar felt it when he walked under the basilica's shade. The air seemed older. He looked up at the Capitoline and measured the path from the crowd to the steps where men in white-bordered togas debated. He chose the courts as his first stage. Oratory could lift a name faster than any parade. He rehearsed at dawn, voice low to spare his throat, pacing near the Tiber's edge where the river's rush masked his cadence. He worked at rhythm, at hand movement, at where to pause. He borrowed from older masters but cut the heavy parts. He aimed for clarity and sting. Clients came. He spoke for provincial victims against corrupt governors, carefully, not in cases that would burn him too soon. He opposed strong men in tone and timing, not in direct collision. He had learned from Sulla what raw force could do. He would not meet it head-on without leverage. Facts again guided the shape of his days. A quaestorship could come if he won a place on the ballot and secured enough votes. Votes came from tribes, guilds, veterans, and patrons. Votes also came from memories of a clear speech, a kind favor, a debt forgiven, a small loan at the right hour. He kept lists and courted allies without being seen to beg. He held to a simple domestic image: loyal husband, careful son, devoted to sacred rites even after losing the Jupiter priesthood. Public stories gave cover for private moves. Yet he could not fully escape his old ties. Some still saw him as Marius's kin, a shadow from a violent decade. Others saw a bold young aristocrat ready to spend money he did not have to win glory. Both images held some truth. He rubbed at a thin scar under his hairline and felt a quiet anger at limits, at rules that kept him from Rome's core. Anger could be fuel if he cooled it first. He did. He always tried. The city taught him patience again. He failed at a small bit, won one step, then held back when a patron warned him off another. He visited neighborhoods where gutters ran high after rain and listened to men who smelled of wool dye and fish brine. He visited older senators in their leafed courtyards where water clocked softly against stone. He practiced the art of entering and leaving at the right moment. He became known for his memory of names: porters, freedmen, clerks, and the sons of great houses. No one was too small to note. He planned for the day when each would matter. He stayed alert for signs, the kind that tell a city its weather is turning. A sudden acquittal of a notorious governor suggested a block had tightened. A street rumor about a rising orator hinted at a rival's new funding. A new amphora tax fell hard on wine cellars and shifted market moods. He collected these details like a scout collects dry twigs, light, simple, ready to catch. Strategy grew from piles of small things. This first chapter of his life closed with a sense of direction, not closure. He was still young. He had survived a purge, learned the ways of the army, and found his voice in court. He had taken measured risks, built networks, and kept his name intact. The city was opening, slowly. He stood again at dawn in a Roman courtyard, listening to the steps in the alley, feeling the damp on the stones. He had learned how to wait for the right footfall and when to move. Chapter 2. Pirates, Pride, and a Name. The sea smelled of tar and salt when he stepped onto the deck. Morning haze blurred the islands into low shapes, like beasts asleep. The crew moved with quiet rhythm, ropes creaking against wood. He watched the shoreline slip by and measured his next move. He sailed east to build credit and skill. Asia Minor held governors, courts, and small wars, places where a young Roman could be seen. He carried letters and ambition, not much else. The wind was steady, and his thoughts were fixed on rank. He served on a governor's staff near the Aegean coast. The work was part camp, part court, and part counting house. He learned the chain of supply, grain tallies, mule hire, contracts, and cramped rooms. The smell of waxed tablets and wet leather filled those halls. He watched how orders traveled. A line written at noon bent a city's work by sunset. Local kings bowed, then bargained hard. Veterans drilled in dusty fields while clerks copied decrees in neat lines. He saw how Rome's reach depended on careful hands. He also learned how rumors moved faster than fleets. A visit to Bithynia raised whispers, talk that linked his name to King Nicomedes. The court was lush with music and carved wood. He went to secure ships and favor. The talk stayed longer than the facts. He brushed those whispers aside and focused on results. He secured what Rome needed: oarsmen, timber, and safe harbors along the coast. He spoke softly, watched faces, and kept close notes. He learned that pride survived best under a plain cloak. By 76 to 75 BCE, the sea lanes turned more dangerous. Cilician pirates roamed between Rhodes and the Carian coast. They struck fast, took hostages, and vanished into coves. Their camps smelled of smoke and brine. He took a small vessel toward Rhodes to study under a famed orator. Voice mattered in Rome. Training here could shape a career. The crossing seemed simple, short, direct, safe enough. It was not. Sails appeared at dawn, dark against pale water. The pirate ships moved like wolves in broken fog. His crew froze, then tried to run with a sharp turn. Oars bit water. It was too late. Boarders came with bare feet and hard eyes. They dragged men across wet planks and stripped the deck of gear. He stood straight, face calm, counting blades and bodies. He understood how quickly the world could narrow to a rope and a knife. They took him to a low island near the Korean shore. The camp had lean tents and cooking fires that smelled of fish stew. Captives waited near a rocky inlet, guarded by men with scarred arms. He judged the camp's strength: boats, watchposts, the path to higher ground. The pirates set a ransom. They chose a modest sum. He laughed, brief, cold, and told them to raise it. They did. The number rose to fit his rank. It also bought time. Waiting created its own kind of map. He rose early, watched the bay's light, and listened to camp rhythms. He played board games with guards and kept notes in his head. How many men, how they quarreled, who led them. He practiced speeches by the surf, voice low under the wind. His calm unsettled them. He wrote letters for the ransom and sent them with trusted men. He spoke as if command were his right, as if capture were a delay, not a defeat. He kept his posture and his temper. Pride held him still. He also watched for mercy's small doors. He treated his guards with dry humor and respect. He did not beg. He offered poems and readings to pass the time, simple pieces shaped by study. He was the prisoner who behaved like a patron. That contrast mattered. Ransom custom required patience. Messengers moved along rocky tracks. Coins were counted in cautious towns. He slept near the waterline and stayed alert for change. The island's wind carried a taste of salt and ash. Payment came in sudden weight, bags of coin carried from a beached skiff. The pirates counted twice and cut his bonds. He thanked no one. He walked to the boat and looked back with a face that hid his plan. He had memorized their camp. He traveled to Miletus and gathered ships. He used favors from earlier service and called in local allies. He filled light craft with determined men, enough to match the island's force, not more. Speed mattered more than scale. They rowed at night. The sea's skin turned black and still, broken by muffled oars. He pointed toward the cove and outlined the entry in simple words. He had spent weeks here. He knew each bend of rock. Dawn gave them a gray shield. They slid past the outer point, while gulls cried from the cliff. The first campfire sparked. He raised his arm and sent the lead boat straight for the beach. The surprise held for a breath, then two. The fight was short and loud. Sand flew under men's heels. Blades clicked. Shouts broke the thin morning air. He moved along the line and kept units tight in pairs. The pirates broke first near the water barrels, then near the gate. They took prisoners and counted their dead. He chose a punishment that matched Roman practice, crucifixion for pirates. He also ordered throats cut first to spare long agony. The air smelled of pine pitch and blood. The lesson was sharp. News of the raid spread along the coast. Townsfolk of the young Roman who paid, watched, and struck. He returned loot to allies and took credit only when it helped the larger story. He had turned an insult into a proof of nerve. He reached Rhodes and resumed study. The famed orator, Molon, taught balance and restraint. The training halls smelled of chalk dust and oil lamps. He worked at pacing, at how to rise and fall in tone, at when to pause. He sanded rough edges from his style. He kept clarity and cut fat. He learned to hold a crowd with structure, not noise. He thought of the forum and of juries in white-striped tunics. He shaped his voice for them. He also stayed near the coast to watch the pirate war unfold. Roman commanders finally launched broader campaigns. They pushed raiders from coves and burned stockpiles. The Aegean grew safer in steps, not in one sweep. He saw how slow policy could be. He kept writing to Rome. Letters carried his record and his hope for office. He had a story now: service, risk, and a measured victory. Each line framed him as useful and sane. He had learned to weigh image against truth. By 74 to 73 BCE, he drifted back toward Italy. The sea lanes were calmer, and his purse was not empty. He left behind a small wake of favors, money lent, introductions made, promises kept. He would call on them later. This was his habit. He returned to Roman shores with rainy weather and the smell of wet stone. The docks hummed with work. Porters bent under amphora, mule carts grinding on ruts. He lifted his cloak and moved through the crowd, head low. He was not famous yet. He was steady. Rome had shifted again while he was gone. Trials filled basilicas, new men rose in courts. Veterans pressed claims in side streets. The city's pulse felt a little faster, a little harsher. He tasted dust and thought of his chances. He resumed oratory at once. He targeted cases that fit his image, provincial victims harmed by greedy magistrates. He spoke with new weight and less ornament. His time at Rhodes had cut his style to the bone. Juries listened. He built his circle with care. Young nobles drifted toward him. Shopkeepers in the Suburra nodded at his name. He never forgot a face. He learned which baker's brother had a vote in a key tribe. He learned which senator's freedman carried letters late. Maps lived in his head. He courted older patrons, but kept a measure of independence. Debt hung on him like a cloak. He wore it lightly. He used loans to fund public shows in small bursts, enough to be seen, not enough to drown. He had learned the cost of going too far. He also watched for a larger stage. The cursus honorum, Rome's ladder of office, asked for a quaestor. A quaestorship meant treasury work and a step into Senate ranks. It could lead to a provincial post and more power. He aimed there. He leaned on the story of his capture and revenge. It cast him as brave, quick, and loyal to Roman order. It was a story that common men could repeat in taverns. It also reassured cautious nobles. He had punished pirates, not senators. He kept to a modest home and controlled his temper. He did not forget slights, but he shelved them for later. He took long walks near the Tiber at dawn, when fog sat low on the reeds. He spoke his arguments under his breath, and timed the pauses. Anchors in time gave the path shape. The pirate raid belonged to 75 BCE. His return and study framed the years afterward. Rome's slow turn from fear after Sulla's death continued in these seasons. He judged when to push and when to wait. He had one more small test at sea before he locked into city life. A coastal convoy from Ostia to Massilia needed protection. He took a role as advisor and saw how escorts placed their hulls. He tweaked spacing and saved a grain ship from a late attack. It was a narrow save, but it mattered. These months hardened his sense of scale. Not every victory was Alasia. Not every risk was the Rubicon. Small actions could earn trust and coin. Small actions could teach the weight of a choice. He collected them like stones for a future bridge. He carried himself as if the next step would accept him. This was not arrogance alone. It was a belief that practice created doors. He had practiced survival under Sulla. He had practiced patience with pirates. He had practiced voice on an island's wind. He stepped into the forum one cool morning and felt the city lean his way. It was a light shift, just a degree. Clients waited near the rostra. Clerks nodded. An old senator lifted 2 fingers in a slight salute. The stones held his footfall with equal weight. The path ahead was not narrow now. It was crowded. Rivals watched his rise with cautious respect. Allies asked for favors with more boldness. He kept his lists and his calm. He carried the island's wind in his chest when the forum air grew thick. The chapter closed with a man returned from sea, sharpened and known. He had turned capture into proof and study into skill. He had not yet commanded legions or bent a continent to his will, but he had a name that carried and a city ready to listen. Chapter 3: Ladders, Debts, and the Crowd. He rose before first light and warmed his voice with low phrases. The river air cooled his throat as fog hugged the bank. He watched the current take straw and bits of bark, and he pictured jurors as drifting floats. In Rome, a case was a current, set it right at the start, and the rest followed. He chose his early prosecutions with care. Greedy governors had left trails of bruised towns and empty treasuries. He read depositions by lamplight, ink drying thin on wax. He pictured the faces behind the lines: Greek shopkeepers, Spanish muleteers, tax clerks with cramped hands. He would speak for them, and, by speaking, set his own steps. He kept his stance steady when he entered the basilicas. The public halls glowed with morning dust and quiet coughs. Clients fanned out behind him, tunics neat, eyes on his shoulders. He felt their weight and saw the line ahead: quaestor, aedile, praetor, consul. The latter had names, but it also had costs. His voice filled the long rooms. He used short clauses and clear turns, letting each fact land before the next. He cut ornament and spared metaphors for the close. Juries watched his hands and listened for rhythm. He felt when they leaned his way and when they did not. He learned to shift pace without showing strain. Victories stacked slowly. A corrupt official found guilty here, a settlement forced there. He did not chase every charge. He let others take bruising cases that promised fame and ruin. He aimed for steady gains with clean edges. He wanted Rome to see him as firm, not reckless. 2 funerals tested that image. In 69 BCE, his Aunt Julia died. She had been Marius's widow and his tie to a fierce past. He stood at the rostra and praised her lineage before a silent crowd. The air smelled of hot stone and laurel. He pulled on old names with care and framed them as Roman virtues. The gesture stirred pride and unease. That same year, his wife Cornelia died young. He felt the loss as a dull, constant ache. He spoke in her honor with fewer words, voice low, eyes fixed on a point above the crowd. A hush carried across the forum's edges. He learned how grief could join with craft, and how dangerous that mix could be for a man set on power. The elections for quaestor approached with summer heat. He counted tribal votes like coins. He walked the neighborhoods with sandaled patience and made small promises that cost little at the time. He lent money to the right men and wrote notes to their cousins. He felt debt build like a slow tide around his ankles. He won the quaestorship and the right to sit in the Senate. The ivory curule chair was not his yet, but the hall had opened. The Senate smell was old wood and oil lamps. Voices rose and fell like crows in a grove. He kept his face neutral and learned where to stand, to be seen but not targeted. Hispania awaited him, Spain's western provinces under Roman rule. The assignment offered pay, a taste of command, and distance from rivals. He sailed from Ostia as gulls traced his wake. The voyage was calm, and he let his shoulders slacken for the first time in months. He looked west and thought about how grain, gold, and men moved. Hispania's light cut hard across hills and river plains. The towns wore Roman shapes, grids, forums, tiled roofs, but the land kept its older pulse. He took charge of accounts, storage, and troop pay. The smell of stacked barley and oiled leather filled his days. He learned the names of local leaders and the brokers who set mule prices. He walked granaries and tapped amphorae with his knuckles. A small dispute over tax arrears tested his sense. A city claimed exemptions granted long ago. A collector pressed for full share. He read the charter, listened to elders, and counted coin with a cool eye. He cut a deal that preserved honor and met quota. The ledger closed neat. Reputation traveled faster than writs in a tight province. He felt doors open halfway at his approach. He also felt the pull of ambition. Roads ran to hill forts where bandits watched from scrub. He weighed a quick raid to win a wreath and chose restraint. He remembered the pirates and the value of timing. He would not waste men or grain on a trophy. He would write Rome that the province had quieted, with numbers to prove it. He returned to the capital with a slightly heavier purse and many more names. The city greeted him with rain and the smell of wet wool. He entered the Senate in his new shoes and the same calm. He had not yet paid his debts, but he had charts in his head now. Who owed whom, and how far a favor could stretch before it snapped. He needed allies with deep benches. He studied Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He watched their clients, glanced at their freedmen, and tracked how their influence moved like a shadow at noon. He did not rush to either camp. He built trust first, with smaller men who could open larger doors. Public shows offered one path to those doors. He spent money he did not have on modest games and repairs to communal halls. He made sure bread lines ran smooth, and that crowd marshals kept order. He stood at the edge of the circus and looked up at cheap seats. He understood that loyalty grew in the places where elbows touched. His debts climbed. Interest whispered from ledgers. He slept less and counted paths out. A marriage could help. He chose Pompeia, granddaughter of Sulla, and a link to the old guard. The house smelled of cedar chests and new cloth. The match surprised some and angered others. He wanted a bridge into rooms that had once closed to him. He got one, narrow and watched. He kept his mother Aurelia close to the center of the household. Her judgment trimmed his worst impulses. She ran the house like a miniature state. Suppliers, schedules, and quiet discipline. He respected the order she maintained and the shield it gave his public life. He needed that ground to stand on as he moved. He pursued the aedileship next, an office that managed markets, temples, and public games. The post fed a reputation if handled well. It also ate money. He accepted the cost. He collected loans with a straight face and a silent plan to repay from later provinces. He knew this was the Roman way. He did not flinch. Temples shone under his orders. He restored modest shrines and made sure the work crews were paid. He placed his name where custom allowed, in letters that did not shout. He walked markets at dawn and checked stall weights with a traveling scale. He learned the smell of rancid oil and the complaints of fishmongers. He heard which guilds muttered and which smiled. Games filled the calendar. He staged them with precision rather than bloat. The arena sand smelled of blood and damp straw. He kept his face still as beasts and men met, and he watched the crowd more than the ring. He measured where cheers peaked and how long they lasted. He wanted memory, not a moment. He wanted names repeated beside wine jugs at dusk. All the while he argued cases. He used the edile stage to anchor his words. He invited jurors to see order in his work and justice in his voice. He began to feel the rhythm of a city swinging his way, half a beat, then a full one. He did not trust it. He remembered how quickly a wind shifted in a harbor. A scandal cut through that lift. The Bonadia rites, sacred to women alone, were held at his home in 62 BCE. A young patrician tried to enter in disguise. The city gasped. He felt the blow as a tremor in the walls. The case hit honor, religion, and his doorstep at once. He kept his bearing in the Senate and let process grind. He divorced Pompeia to protect his path. Harsh, surgical, necessary. He learned a simple rule again. A public life leaks inward. He placed the scandal on a shelf and pressed on. The praetorship loomed ahead, an office of courts and imperium. He set his feet for the climb with old tools, clarity, favors, and relentless presence. He knew the city's routes now. He could walk from the Suburra to the Palatine without thinking, nodding to names in right order, using each corner's shadow to gain small seconds. He kept one eye on the provinces. Hispania called again, this time as governor, if he could secure the slot. A governorship meant soldiers, taxes, and the chance to pay down ruinous loans. It meant power carried openly. It also meant risk, rebellions, angry town councils, and Roman politics waiting for missteps. He weighed the sums at night with the Tiber's rush in his ears. Anchor points fixed the flow. The funerals belonged to 69 BCE. The quaestorship and Spanish service followed soon after. The aedileship filled 65 BCE with careful shows and harder bills. The Bonadia scandal shook 62 BCE. He lined these dates in his mind like pebbles along a path. They kept his stride even when streets bucked underfoot. He learned to forgive small insults and store larger ones. He learned which men could hold a secret and which needed to be flattered in public and starved in private. He eased a client's family into a warmer apartment before winter and saw gratitude turn into votes. He arranged a guild's petition to arrive at the right hour when a rival was tired and sloppy. He bent without bowing. He taught himself to rest in quick pieces. A cup of watered wine in a side portico. A few breaths in a temple's cool shadow. A slow walk along the Saepta, where vendors set their counters in straight rows. He let the city's textures wash over him and then recede. He returned to his lists with a calmer head. He could feel something forming beyond his sight, alliances that might pull Pompey and Crassus into the same tent, at least for a time. He understood need where others saw only pride. He had need as well, and he knew how to fit need with need until a plan held weight. He kept that thought behind his eyes and said nothing. By the end of this stretch, he stood on firmer ground than the young fugitive who had fled Sulla. He had a Senate seat, a base among the people, and a reputation for energy and grace. He had debts like anchors and favors like rope. He held both and moved anyway. The ladder rose above him, clear and steep. He had learned where each rung creaked and which hands helped or shook. He was ready to lean the city's whole weight onto the next step and accept the sway that always followed. Chapter 4: The Priest's Chair and the Knife's Edge. Morning over the forum threw pale light on marble steps. He stood at the edge and watched vendors lift their awnings. The air smelled of damp dust and crushed time from nearby stalls. He felt the city's mood, curious, restless, and close to turning. He aimed higher than most men dared. The office was ancient, Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome. It meant control of sacred calendars, public rites, and the city's moral face. It also meant a house on the forum's shoulder and a title that turned heads. The election of 63 BCE drew lines across every street. Senators weighed prestige and grudges. Guilds counted favors. Tribes gathered near assembly enclosures with whispers about omens and debts. He entered this mix with a calm face and an empty purse. He asked for help where help was deepest. Marcus Crassus, whose wealth ran like a river, extended credit again. The sums were large, the terms were quiet. He smiled thinly and accepted. He understood that money in Rome bought time, not freedom. He campaigned like a man with no path back. He visited shrines at dawn and old families at dusk. He held infants for mothers in crowded courtyards and spoke softly to veterans in smoke-dark taverns. He promised little, but he promised presence, his face, his voice, his steadiness. His rivals were older, richer, and safer choices. They counted on tradition and on Rome's habit of choosing gray hair for sacred roles. He set another image beside theirs, youth that carried duty with clear eyes. He wore plain wool and clean shoes. He stood very still when crowds pressed in. Election day began before sunrise. Tribes filed through wooden pens and cast their ballots. The ropes creaked as men leaned forward to see. The smell of wool, sweat, and lamp oil filled the air. He watched the scribe's hands and kept his pulse steady. The count rolled toward him. Surprise spread first in the back rows, then across the whole field like a slow fire. He had won. He had beaten both favorites. The result felt improbable to others. To him, it felt earned. He let the roar wash over him, then lifted his hand once, calm and brief. The house of the Pontifex Maximus sat near the forum's slope. He moved in with his mother and his wife, Pompeia. The place was both home and stage, courtyards for business, rooms for rites, thresholds that mattered. He walked the halls at night and touched the cool plaster walls. He understood that Rome had given him its front door. The year itself carried more weight. It was 63 BCE. Rumors threaded the city about Catiline, a proud man sunk in debt and anger. Talk of plots swirled, fires planned, daggers hidden, exiles summoned. The Senate met often under tense skies. Boots thudded along the paving at odd hours. He occupied a narrow ledge between fear and law. He was praetor-elect, a priest already, and a rising name among the people. He favored process in the Senate, even when others shouted for swift punishments. He argued that executions without trial stained the city. He kept his tone even, his words tight. He could sense who listened and who scowled. The consul that year, Cicero, faced the crisis with flourished speeches and quick moves. Arrests came, confessions followed, and then the sharp question, what sentence for Roman men accused of treason? The chamber air grew heavy. He stood and pressed for caution. He did not aim to save the accused. He aimed to save the city's habits. His position angered many. It also taught him the cost of being seen as a limit on fear. Votes ran against him, and the executions occurred. The bodies vanished into cold earth beyond the walls. He left the meeting and crossed the forum under a flat winter sky. He knew he would carry both the principle and the suspicion for years. Praetorship began in 62 BCE with the machinery of courts. He presided with care, the way a builder tests a beam. He listened to advocates, watched juries, and punished open bribery. The halls smelled of ink and old wood. He kept cases moving and avoided theatrical rage. His reputation for order grew. Then the knife came from within the house. The Bonadia rites, sacred to women only, were held at his residence that winter night. A young patrician, bold and foolish, tried to enter in disguise. The city woke to the scandal like a kicked dog. It bit in all directions at once. He stood at the center of a storm he had not made. Custom had been broken under his roof. He kept his face calm in public and let the courts grind toward the intruder. He divorced Pompeia to guard the office and the path ahead. The move felt like a clean cut through tough cloth. It left edges that would not quite meet again. Neighbors watched his door in silence. Clerks brought messages with lowered eyes. He walked the inner court and counted the steps. He understood that Rome judged not only guilt but sent, what clung to a man after trouble passed. He would give the city a clean smell again through work and measured mercy. The year closed and drew him toward Spain. A provincial command in Hispania Ulterior was within reach. Soldiers, taxes, and a chance to pay down ruinous loans. He prepared to leave, but creditors blocked his departure. Their agents stood near the docks and named the sums in tight voices. The sea breeze smelled of pitch and salt. Crassus intervened again. He guaranteed the debts and cleared the path. The gesture tied them closer in ways both men understood. He stepped onto the gangway with a lighter step and a heavier bond. The ship pitched past Ostia and took him toward a new test. Hispania met him with hot light, hard roads, and mixed loyalties. Roman rule sat on river towns like a lid. The hills steamed with small wars. He found legions thin on officers and supply lines frayed. The granaries rustled with mice, the muleteers muttered about pay. He set his jaw and worked from the center out. He rode the province like a surveyor. He counted days of grain in each depot and matched them to road miles. He replaced slow quartermasters and paid out arrears where proof was clear. The soldier's mood shifted by degrees. Camps smelled of fresh-cut steaks and boiled lentils. Men drilled with better rhythm. Bandit chiefs tested the edges. He answered with quick marches and tight ambushes. He used light troops to bend raiders toward a waiting cohort, then closed fast. The fights were brief and close. Dust-caked mouths. Shields rang. He awarded honors in front of assembled units, small oak wreaths, and names carved into unit boards. Fortified hill towns watched him with worried eyes. He sent messages that mixed threat and order. Tax on time, hostages returned, markets protected. He kept his word and punished late payments. The province learned his cadence. It respected the results. He also chased a larger sign, triumph. A triumph meant a formal victory parade in Rome, but the bar for that honor was high. He judged that his campaign might qualify if he struck one more blow and widened Roman peace. He planned a hard push against the Lusitanian force that had pinned a road between valleys. The march ran through dry scrub in summer heat. The air smelled of dust and resin. He split his force at a ford and baited with a small detachment. The enemy charged across the shallow water and met a wall of pila, heavy javelins that shattered shields. His second line rolled left and folded their flank. The route was sharp. The road opened. He wrote the report with crisp numbers and sober praise. He did not gild his own role. He let the results speak, secured towns, seized weapons, collected taxes, freed markets. The courier left with orders, names, and a hope tucked into the seal. He imagined the Senate's faces as they read. His fortune rose in clinks rather than heaps. Provincial fines and the sale of captured stock helped. He parceled the sums to agents in Rome. Some lenders grew quiet. Others smiled too much. He slept better and kept riding. He had learned that money was a current, always moving, never staying where you left it. Winter over the province sounded like rain on tile and low talk in barracks. He walked the perimeter of a camp near a river and felt the wheel turn toward home. His term neared its end. He had pressed the hills, balanced accounts, and shown that he could hold command. He could ask now, in a firmer voice, for Rome to match his effort with honor. The triumph question came to a head when he reached Italy's edge. Custom required a general seeking a triumph to wait outside the city until the Senate's vote. Custom also required a man seeking the consulship to enter the city in person to declare his candidacy. The dates collided like carts in a narrow lane. He stood near the city boundary and weighed a choice that carried more than one life. Triumph would set his name in golden light for a day and a half. The consulship would put his hands on law, legions, and alliances for a year and beyond. He looked toward the walls and listened to the wind in the grass. He chose entry. He let the chance of triumph fall and crossed the sacred line. Dust lifted around his sandals as he stepped into Rome. He felt the city take his weight again. He had selected long power over brief glory. The move told allies and rivals how he thought. It told Crassus that his loans backed a man focused on office, not parade. It told Pompey, returned from Eastern wars and tangled in Senate delays, that here stood someone who could trade need for need. It told the people that he valued tomorrow's bread over today's show. The months that followed were a surge. He courted votes with careful promises and hard work. He held morning audiences until his voice thinned and then held them still. He arranged for veterans' claims to receive hearing, for tax farmers to face limits, and for urban works to employ idle hands. He offered structure where others offered noise. He also kept the priesthood's duties with precision. He set festivals on the right days and supervised rites with clean care. He walked temple courts that smelled of olive oil and incense and spoke to wardens about repairs. He was the state's face in prayer and its mind in policy. The pair sat well on him. Anchors kept the story clear. The Pontifex Maximus victory came in 63 BCE. The Catilinarian crisis struck that same year. The Bonadea scandal shook his house in 62. His spaniel terrier tested him as governor soon after. His return placed him before the consulship race, with choices that cut across custom and pride. He understood now that Rome ran on schedules as much as swords. Calendars, court days, election dates, and harvest windows each had weight. He kept those weights in his head and moved under them with skill. He sensed that two great men, Pompey and Crassus, might be drawn into the same rope if he set the knot right. At night, he walked the upper forum and looked toward the dark hill where the Capitoline temple sat. The stones cooled under his sandals, the city's hum dropped to a hush. He thought of the priest's chair and the blade of scandal, of Spain's heat and the narrow ford, of the wall he had crossed without triumph. He felt the shape of the next step. The chapter closed with a man holding two kinds of authority in one frame. He was Rome's chief priest and Rome's most agile politician. He had paid for both with coin, restraint, and a cut through his private life. Ahead lay a pact that would bend the republic's frame and set him on the road to wars measured in continents, not valleys. Chapter 5. 3 Men in a City. Cold air hung over the forum when he made the first quiet moves. The paving stones held last night's damp, and mules clattered under loads of firewood. He had a list in his head: names, grudges, and needs. He saw how 3 separate currents might join into one river. Pompey had returned from the east with unmatched glory. His troops were settled far from home. His settlement plans stalled under Senate caution. He wanted land for veterans and formal recognition of his treaties. He needed a partner to wrestle the chamber's pride into consent. Crassus, richest of Romans, had weight of another kind. His clients filled streets and guilds. His money reached into court benches. The tax companies, the equestrian firms, had overbid for Asian revenues and now bled cash. Crassus wanted relief that the Senate would not grant. He needed a door opened without losing face. Caesar, consulship within reach, needed both men. He carried debts like chains wrapped in silk. He needed a year of power to turn debt into leverage and to fix his place in Rome. He could give what each wanted and ask for what he lacked: time, troops, and a province fit for ambition. The pact formed in late 60 BCE in steps rather than one embrace. He met each man with a calm face and a sharp memory. He set terms that matched their needs and hid their fears. He asked for trust built on shared interest, not affection. Interest held longer. He bound the pact with marriages, simple, blunt tokens that the city understood. He took Calpurnia, daughter of Piso, into his house with a father who could bend Senate moods. He gave Julia, his only child, to Pompey, an affectionate link that soothed rivalry. The air around these unions smelled of new cloth and incense. The message was plain. The elections set him in the consul's curule chair for 59 BCE. His colleague was Bibulus, a stiff man backed by the Senate's wary faction. The year began with layered rites, sacrifices, oaths, and formal words spoken under winter light. He felt the weight of law settle on his shoulders like a cloak lined with lead. He moved at once to the land question. Pompey's veterans waited for farms. The city's poor waited for a chance at small plots. He crafted a bill that mixed fairness with speed. Public land in Campania, careful commissions, limits on graft. The text smelled of wax and fresh-cut tablet edges. He wanted results more than theater. The Senate stalled. Some feared his momentum, others despised Pompey's looming shape beyond the plan. He took the bill to the People's Assembly, a legal route with sharper edges. He stood on the rostra and laid out numbers, boundaries, and rules. He kept his voice even and his tone clean of insult. Crowds pressed forward under the spring sun. Bibulus tried to block the vote with ritual claims and rigid warnings. The square tightened. He kept the meeting open and let the tribes cast ballots. The law passed. The city learned that he could bend structure without breaking it, and that he would choose that path when pushed. He used the same method for Crassus's cause. The tax contractors gained their relief, rebates to match a changed market and a softer future bid. The trade streets hummed with a different note that week. He did not gloat. He wrote his edicts in neat lines and moved on. He did not forget opponents, but he managed them with care. Cato, iron in human form, spoke for delays, warnings, and the old order's exact words. Caesar let him talk as long as rules allowed, then called votes with dry precision. He understood the value of measured mercy, enough courtesy to keep process intact, enough force to keep the year moving. Bibulus withdrew soon after a bruising day in the Forum. He claimed signs in the sky and closed himself behind doors. He spent the months issuing notices that the heavens disapproved of public action. Caesar kept working, hearings, building plans, and land commissions. The city joked in low voices about who truly governed, but he ignored the noise. He had schedules to meet. He strengthened bonds with tribes and guilds through small, clean acts. He narrowed grain loss on river barges with tighter seals. He forced auction clarity on public contracts and posted the terms in clear letters. He met veterans in dusty lots on the city's edge and pointed to measured fields on wax maps. The air there smelled of turned soil. Hope settled like light over those gatherings. He also secured a longer horizon. The Vatinian law, passed in 59 BCE, granted him Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum for 5 years. A long provincial command meant legions and freedom to plan. Narbonensis, the Transalpine strip, followed soon after when a vacancy opened. He walked the line of maps in a back room and felt the pull of rivers and roads. The North called to him. He kept the priesthood's duties with the same steady hand. Festivals landed on their marked days. Omens were read with sober calm. He stood under temple roofs that smelled of smoke and laurel and made sure nothing there gave easy scandal. His public life had clean edges now. He intended to keep them. Not every measure bore peace. He aided the rise of Claudius to the tribunate for 58 BCE, a move that cut against old wounds but offered utility. Claudius turned his energy toward street power, grain laws, guilds, and personal feuds. He drove Cicero into exile with a legal strike that still smelled of vengeance. Caesar watched the streets fill with new gangs and weighed the cost. He filed the knowledge. He would spend it later. Money demanded attention, even inside triumphs. He paid down loans with proceeds from auctions and with help channeled through friends. He knew which creditors could be soothed with a schedule and which required a larger prize later. He kept his head high at midday and balanced ciphers at night. Debt taught discipline, again and again. He made time for simple displays that signaled stability. Modest repairs to roads near the Tiber, canals cleared, and a new schedule for market inspections. He walked muddy work sites and counted loads, leaving in orderly lines. The smell of wet clay and cut reeds met him along the bank. These acts did not sing, but they lasted. Opponents tested the lines in court. He responded with calm filings, clean precedents, and patient clerks. He refused to widen quarrels that would live longer than they paid. He learned, as always, when to stand and when to step aside. He kept the year from fracturing into a feud he could not use. The spring and summer shot past, on coordinated rails. Land assignments began to bite into claims. Veterans moved from hope to work. Surveyors marked boundary stones under sun glare. The forum's rumors shifted from if to how. He cultivated that tone. Quiet progress, low drama, steady pulse. He could feel the city grow used to his speed. He never forgot the army waiting at the edge of his horizon. He collected officers with care, men who could build a camp by measure and hold a line under rain. He stored equipment where roads could carry it north with ease. He watched prices for mules and grain and bought early. Logistics was a language. He spoke it now. The priest's house looked out over the heart of Rome. At dusk, oil lamps sent a soft sheen across the courtyard pool. He stood there and felt the day's work settle. The noise of carts and voices climbed the slope and thinned in the colonnade. He pictured mountain passes, long rivers, and woods. No surveyor had claimed for Rome. The view stretched beyond roofs and alleys. He did not neglect image. He hosted modest dinners where rival freedmen could talk without glare. He attended to the small kindnesses that make votes stick. Letters for a cousin's post, a quiet word for a targeted shopkeeper, a widow's petition moved up the basket. He left grand gestures to men who needed applause now. He needed depth. Anchors in time kept the year framed. The pact formed in 60 BCE. The consulship ran through 59. The Bithynian law set his command length. Narbonensis slid into his hands by opportunity, not decree, a governor's death leaving a gap the assembly could fill. He kept those marks bright in his mind. They were steps on a ramp that rose north. Julia's marriage to Pompey softened jealous murmurs and turned them to compliments. She brought grace to crowded rooms and steadied Pompey's pride when others prodded it. Caesar saw how that private tie eased public strain. He had bound ambition with affection and reduced friction that might have sparked. It was a calculation with human faces. Crassus received his due with fewer witnesses. The tax issue closed. Contracts were recut. He met Crassus under shadowed eaves and spoke about risks and future terms. Money had no scent, but it left trails. He followed those trails to future needs. Pay for legions, bribes for border chiefs, loans for sudden bridges. He saw where the streams would meet. As the consular year waned, resistance hardened in small pockets. Cato scolded without end. Bibulus wrote notices with dates and heavens in bold letters. Caesar answered with more work. He filed reports, closed commissions, and left the city's processes cleaner than he had found them. He preferred proof to retort. The proof stood in stone and law. He prepared for departure with the care of a builder leaving a house to new renters. He set Rialto firm ledgers for landlords. He ensured the grain schedule could run without him through winter. He spoke to wardens and architects and left no gaps. The city would not unravel in his absence, if he could help it. He walked the boundary line where sacred rules split city from field. The air there smelled of crushed grass and cool dust. He paused to feel both worlds at once, citizen and commander, priest and planner. He had chosen this shape with open eyes. It fit him like a well-worn cloak. At dawn, he rode north with a lean escort. The road out of Rome was still wet from evening dew, and the wheels sang a low note. He did not look back at every turn. He trusted the work behind him and the work ahead. The horizon lifted with each mile. He entered Cisalpine Gaul and felt the country change. Fields widened, towns thinned, mountains pressed against the sky. The Po's flat plains carried mist that smelled of river mud and young wheat. He counted bridges and ferries and marked depots with chalk on a map. He wrote notes in a hand that never drifted. Legions gathered under his standards, men from Italy and from older posts along the frontier. He walked the ranks and saw scars in neat lines. He tested dispatch riders on time and endurance. He drilled units into curves and counter-curves until their movement felt like one body. The army learned his taste for speed and order. A message met him early in Narbonensis, heavy with alarm. Tribes beyond the Alps stirred and shifted, tugged by pressures he could not yet see. Rumor spoke of Helvetii plans and of Germanic movements under a new chieftain. The smoke at the edges of the map grew thicker. He stood over the table and traced river bends with a finger. He understood the turn. The consul's year had polished his civilian hand. The northern command would test his military mind. He carried both now, law's cadence and war's rhythm. The pairing promised danger and room. He welcomed both. The chapter closed on the threshold of action. One city satisfied for now, one army ready, one frontier unsettled. Behind him lay a pack that held, because need held. Ahead lay a series of choices, measured in marches, bridges, and sieges. He had shaped a year to serve a decade. Now the decade began. Chapter 6, Rivers, Roads, and a Ring of Thorns. The river ran cold and quick under a gray spring sky. He stood on its bank with mud on his boots and a map under his hand. The current hissed against stones, and the wind tugged at the edges of his cloak. The frontier had its own voice. In 58 BCE, the Helvetii gathered to migrate west. Their carts stretched for miles. Their plan threatened allies and grain routes alike. He saw both danger and chance in that movement. A moving people could become a moving shield, or a spark. He blocked their path at the Salone with speed. Scouts marked a shallow ford. Engineers cut timber for a quick bridge. The smell of wet wood and pitch filled the air. He threw a legion across before the Helvetii could form. The clash was hard and close. Armor rang. Shields thudded. Dust rose in a bitter cloud. He kept reserves tight and fed them in with a measured hand. The line held, then bit. He shadowed the survivors across rough country. Supply carts creaked over ruts. The army drank rivers dry by noon. He counted grain by the day and ordered ration cuts when foragers came back late. The Helvetii turned to fight on open ground nearby Bracte. He set the field as if he were laying bricks. Legions in depth, cavalry on the wings. Steep ground held for leverage. The sun slid between clouds and flashed off spear points. When the push came, his line bent and then sprang forward. The victory broke the migration. He counted the living and demanded hostages. He ordered the Helvetii back to their lands to serve Rome as a buffer. It was order wrapped around brutality. It also served the map. Word of a Germanic king, Ariovistus, reached him soon after. The man had crossed the Rhine and bullied galley tribes into tribute. Rome had recognized him in a careless vote. Recognition now looked like a loaded trap. He marched east into heavy heat. The ground baked. Canteens warmed in men's hands. He moved at evening to spare their strength and drilled camps into the earth at every halt. Each ditch held a night's fear. Ariovistus tested him with sudden moves and short talks that promised nothing. He ignored the noise and built a double camp. The layout smelled of trampled sage and fresh-turned soil. He intended to force a clean fight. When it came, he split the army by habit, strong center, flexible flanks, reserves within reach. The Germans charged in a roar that shook shields. He shifted cohorts where the line dipped, and punched hard where it swelled. The wave lost shape. The field turned. Ariovistus fled for the Rhine with what he could save. Bodies lay in thick stripes across the grass. The victory pushed Germanic threat back over the river, at least for a season. He wrote Rome with facts and quiet pride. Winter bit early that year. Camps smoked under low cloud. Men patched sandals near fire pits. He walked the lines with a cloak pulled tight and counted sick lists with the surgeon. He learned who could stand a week of cold without losing pace. In 57 BCE, the Belgae stirred in the north. Their towns stood behind rivers and low hills. Their pride stood behind both. He moved fast while barley ripened. Speed killed surprise before it was born. He crossed the Exona and split the coalition by hitting the nearest strong tribe. His engineers threw a bridge in a day, piles driven, decking cut, rails lashed. The smell of the river's mud clung to their hands. The army flowed over like poured grain. The siege of the Atuatuci tested patience. Their hilltop held a stout wall and a mocking silence. He answered with earth. Ramps crept forward under wicker screens. Towers rolled on oak wheels. Each sunrise showed the wall a hand's breadth closer. When the gates finally broke, the town tried a night sortie. He had set trip lines and kept horns ready. The alarm ran like lightning along the palisade. The counterstroke slammed shut. Campaigns became a cadence. Scout, bridge, strike, settle. He treated allies with strict fairness and enemies with measured severity. He sent hostages south and took grain north. The legion settled into his rhythm. They liked how it worked. He read a country like a ledger. Rivers were columns. Roads were rows. Towns were sums waiting to be balanced. He moved through Gaul as if it were a problem he could solve with time and weight. He valued both. Then came 55 BCE and the first bridge over the Rhine. He decided to cross not to hold land, but to send a message. The river ran wide and strong. The banks were high and guarded. He built anyway. Piles dropped in at an angle to bite the current. Counter braces, seated upstream to eat the force. Decking went on under shouted counts. The smell of sap and fresh shavings hung heavy. 10 days after the first strike, the army marched across. He spent just long enough on the far bank to burn a few empty villages and reassure shaken allies. The point was proof. Rome could cross where others talked. He returned and cut the bridge down in tidy sections. The river swallowed the evidence, except for rumor. He carried the same logic to sea. Summer light brightened the channel as the fleet gathered near Morini shores. He wanted to test the island beyond, a place of tin, cattle, and pride. The coast smelled of kelp and tar. The landing in Britain in 55 BCE fought him at every step. Surf smashed boats, sand sucked ankles. Painted warriors harried the shallows. He pushed men onto pebbled beach and formed lines under flying spears. The line held, then edged forward, shield by shield. Storms tore his transport ships that night. Ropes snapped, anchors dragged, holes cracked on hidden bars. He spent the next days rebuilding the fleet on an open shore with wet wood and little iron. Engineers cursed the wind and kept sawing. He measured the risk and pulled out when the point was made. He had touched the island and returned alive. The second British expedition in 54 BCE ran deeper inland. He crossed rivers that ran brown and fast and climbed chalk hills that bit calves. He marked tribes by their fields and their faces. The Catuvellani pushed him. The Trinovantes bargained. He collected hostages and left a thin pledge of peace. He did not pretend it would hold without weight. Gaul saw these moves and learned. Tribute weighed on fields. Garrisons weighed on pride. The winter of 54 to 53 BCE cracked the balance. Ambiorix of the Eburones struck a legion in its scattered quarters and broke it with a honeyed promise and a hard ambush. The news reached him under a slate sky. The taste in his mouth turned metallic. He answered with fury tied to form. He hunted Ambiorix through wet woods, burning stores and cutting winter roads with axes. Hoarfrost glittered on brush at dawn. Mud sucked at boots by noon. He set ambushes of his own and gathered the lost where he could. The winter ended with the province quieter in sound but sharper in feeling. Then the bigger fire lit. In 52 BCE, Vercingetorix, a young Arvernian noble with clear eyes and long reach, gathered tribes. He burned his own fields to starve Roman foragers and drew his strength into strong towns. He built a coalition from hunger and insult. The air thickened with smoke from deliberate ruin. He moved to lift the siege of Avaricum, but found scorched earth on every approach. Empty granaries gaped like wounds. Smoke crawled above black fields. He pressed on and captured the town with a storm of ladders and courage. The sacks of grain inside tasted like triumph and ash. He shared them out by strict measure. He chased the Arvernian to Gergovia and found a hill city with sharp teeth. The slopes cut knees. The walls spat javelins. He tried feints, tried subtle climbs at dawn, tried a steady pressure that had broken other stones. The field pushed back. A misread signal and fierce local counterattacks sent cohorts down in ragged lines. Loss settled heavy on the camp. He pulled out and counted that sober weight. He rebalanced with speed. He called allies from the Adosi despite their wavering, squared accounts with harsh words and hostages, and forced the campaign onto open ground again. He won a tight cavalry fight on a flat plain where dust hung at horse height. The enemy learned that Roman equites, backed by Germanic riders he had hired, could now stand and win. The balance shifted by degrees. The final coil tightened at Alesia in autumn 52 BCE. Vercingetorix retreated into the hill fort with thick walls and a basin of fields. Allied relief forces gathered in a ring beyond sight. He decided to trap the inner force while bracing for the outer, 2 sieges in one frame. It was an audacious piece of engineering logic. It fit his mind. He drew 2 lines in earth and timber, one facing inward, one facing outward. Trenches filled with water and stakes lined the bottoms. Ditches ran before ramparts crowned with towers and wicker screens. Wolf pits, camouflage cones with sharpened sticks, lay in fields like sleeping mouths. The works stretched for miles. The smell of cut oak and damp clay stayed on every sleeve. Inside Alesia, ration lines thinned and horses were eaten. Women and children were pushed out and left to beg between rings. He kept the gates shut. The decision was cold and deliberate. Food was a weapon he would not waste. The cries faded under wind. Relief came at last with banners on distant hills. Horns sounded from both sides. The outer ring shook with testing probes. Arrows, quick charges, sudden fires thrown at ramps. He ran the lines at a steady lope. Cloak tight. Voice even. He shifted cohorts like weights on a scale. The worst push struck at dusk on a low saddle. The enemy piled fascines into ditches and poured men over the lip. He had stored ladders, spare stakes, and fresh cohorts within a run of that point. He threw them in, and then sent cavalry wide to bite the attackers from behind. Moonlight picked edges from helms. The ring held. Morning showed bodies in tangled rows and trampled grass that smelled of bruised herbs. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix gathered his armor and walked out on a plain horse. The gesture later grew into legend. The fact was simpler. He yielded to spare more loss. The coalition broke. The war shrank to mopping and careful punishments. He stepped through the quiet aftershock. He accepted hostages, sold prisoners, and parceled penalties with care. He assigned garrisons to roads and river fords and set winter quarters near granaries, not pride. He wrote long reports for Rome and brief notes for allies. He was already shaping how memory would see this year. He also walked the camps and listened for the tone under cheers. The legions had grown under his hand, confident, fast, and used to hard tasks done with minimal talk. They built in neat lines, marched in tight files, and attacked in curves that felt like instinct. He rewarded by rule, crowns, bracelets, and names carved into tablets. He knew exactly why he needed their trust. Anchors fixed the path. The Helvetii fell in 58 BCE. Ariovistus crossed back over the Rhine soon after. The Channel landings came in 55 and 54. Ambiorix hit in the winter that followed. Vercingetorix rose in 52 and broke at Alesia. He kept those marks bright and let the spaces between them fade into habit. Fame surged ahead of him to Rome. His commentary, plain reports shaped to read easily, traveled on fast wagons. Senators frowned and read every page. The people cheered news of bridges thrown down into big rivers, and of winters spent under hostile hills. He felt the pull of praise and the sting of envy. Both were useful. He also watched his own balance sheet. Gaul sent loot, slaves, and tribute south. Debts thinned. New obligations replaced old ones. Pay for auxiliary riders, gifts for chieftains' sons held as pledges, bonuses for re-enlistments. He spent because spending moved wheels. He kept his sums straight. The frontier quieted in places and stayed sharp in others. He learned which tribes loved their independence more than their granaries. He learned where a small fort meant more than a large treaty. He spread his forces to guard roads and wintered them lean. The country sighed under the weight and then adjusted. He stood one evening on a ridge above the Saône, where his first quick bridge had stood. The water ran brown below. Willows hummed with insects. He held a flat stone and turned it in his hand. The campaigns had taught him what engineering could do for strategy and what patience could do for both. A messenger found him in that light. Rome's politics had moved while he had built in earth and timber. Rivals had grown, and alliances had thinned with distance. He folded the note and looked back at the river. The map that mattered next lay south, not north. The chapter closed on a land ringed, cut, and bound by roads. He had turned rivers into lines of march and towns into ledger marks. He had built a machine that could feed itself for a time. Now he would learn how long that time could protect him from the city that never forgave a victor who hesitated. Chapter 7. Ties unravel, knives sharpen. Spring leaned into summer, and the fields rose green along the Po. He walked the edge of a camp ditch and felt the ground firm under his boots. The air smelled of damp earth and horse sweat. News rode north with the light. Julia died first. The year was 54 BCE. Childbirth turned to fever, and fever turned to grief. The tie that had bound Pompey to him in a gentle knot was gone. Rome spoke the news in low voices. Men looked down when they passed him. He kept his face still, and his steps even. He wrote brief letters with a steady hand. He sent gifts to veterans and money to allies. He knew how rumor loved empty space. He filled that space with work. Bridges, roads, and patrol schedules moved ahead as if nothing had changed. Everything had. Crassus died next. The year was 53 BCE. Cari swallowed him in dust and panic. His legions broke against Parthian arrows, and the richest man in Rome left no shape on the field. The triumvirate, 3 men and a city, fell back into 2 men and a problem. He read the report beside a cold brazier and let the ash smell fix the moment. He understood the math. With Julia gone and Crassus gone, the pact had lost its human glue and its money spine. Pompey drifted toward the Senate's wary embrace. He drifted there because the city feared the man on the frontier and loved the man inside its walls. Fear was always the stronger tide. He answered with presence, not noise. He visited posts along the Sound and the Loire and checked winter quarters in person. He put his weight into the machine he had built. The legions felt it. They drilled tighter lines and cut cleaner ditches. He wanted them ready for a different test. Rome leaned the other way. Street gangs under rival leaders traded blows near the basilicas. Elections stalled and then collapsed into riot. The Senate voted motions with more heat than force. Pompey accepted a special command to restore order in 52 BCE. The move placed him at the center of the city, with law wrapped around his shoulders like a cloak. He watched that from the north with a slow burn under calm skin. He knew the powers that came with such a grant. Troops near Rome, control over grain, and courts tuned to a single hand. He read the names attached to those measures. They were names that had worked against him for years. He wrote letters to the Senate with formal respect. He offered to stand for a second consulship in absentia when his term in Gaul ended. He asked for that right because he feared a private return. As a private man, he would face prosecutions for his consular acts from 59 BCE. He had pushed laws hard that year. Enemies waited to make him pay. He preferred to step into Rome with office around him. Office gave time. His opponents shaped a different plan. They wanted him to lay down his command first, then come to trial. They wanted him naked before they touched a vote. Pompey, careful now, signaled that he agreed. He had learned caution with age and glory. Caution made him safe to many and dangerous to one. He did not respond with threats. He responded with structure. He set his legions to winter deeper in Gaul than before. He placed grain in depots near roads that mattered. He rotated officers toward units where loyalty ran thin. He kept his own tent near the hinge of the frontier, not far north and not far south. The air there smelled of pine and cold iron. He sent a long letter to Pompey that read like a soft hand on a shoulder. He suggested that both of them lay down commands at the same time. It was a fair offer in form. It carried a quiet edge in substance. If both stepped back, neither could use troops to bend the vote. He knew how power held men. He suspected the answer before it came. The answer moved slowly through channels and came bent with caution. It was not a clean yes. It was a wary no that hid behind procedure. He saw the shape of it and hardened his schedule. He would not run to the line. He would walk. The frontier kept moving, even as Rome's rope tightened. Small tribes tested garrisons. Germanic bands probed the Rhine crossings. The legions answered with marches that made cart ruts shine. They cut winter roads in frost and burned small caches of stolen grain. He rewarded enough to keep pride warm and punished enough to keep fear near. He returned to the commentariae. He wrote clean pages that stuck to facts and angles. He kept his name on the lips of men who mattered and in the hands of men who held nothing. He understood audience. He gave Rome a version of Gaul that matched the city's idea of itself. Efficient, brave, and destined. His pen served the sword. The Senate's tone sharpened in late 51 BCE. Motions named him as a danger if he held command past his term. Dates were posted. Speeches grew more personal. He looked at a calendar and saw a trap door under winter. He had to finish in Gaul and hold order, while also avoiding an early return without protection. He spread his staff like fingers on a map. He kept a soft line open to men in the middle. Many senators liked order more than either man. They wanted fields planted on time, courts open on schedule, and roads safe enough for carts. He promised those things where he could. He asked in return for time and a clean path to office. The middle liked such talk. The middle seldom decided endings. In 50 BCE, tribunes friendly to him tried to place proposals that would secure his candidacy in absentia. They argued that his service and public peace deserved this favor. Opponents blocked and delayed. Pompey's voice, often quiet in earlier years, grew firmer. He used the city sphere well. He called meetings where he needed them and left others unattended. He raised legions near Rome on a lawful pretext. The streets smelled of lamps burning late. He did not mistake movement for advantage. He watched where money pooled and where it dried. He knew which season squeezed grain sellers and which season set ship owners' rates. He knew how those pressures bent votes. He sent small sums at key moments and held back larger ones for when the river truly turned. He had learned thrift in youth and leverage in Gaul. He paired them now. The year darkened. A governor's term extension failed. A legal ploy stumbled. A friend was prosecuted and exiled. He felt each loss like a stone in the pocket. He did not show it. He took longer walks along camp perimeters at dusk and listened to the clink of tools and the low talk of sentries. The cold air smelled of ash and meat. Cicero returned from exile and tried to balance on a narrow line. He admired order and feared mobs. He enjoyed Pompey's grace, but respected Caesar's reach. His letters read like a man feeling for a rail in the dark. He would lean where wind and honor pushed him. The wind blew toward Pompey by winter. The decisive blow came in January 49 BCE. The Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree. It empowered consuls to defend the state by any means. It named Caesar's refusal to dismiss his legions a threat. It ordered magistrates to act. Words on parchment felt like iron in the hand. He read the news beside a brazier that smoked more than it warmed. The legions watched his face as he folded the sheet. He spoke little that day. He walked to the river that marked the edge of his southern command, small, chill, and unremarkable to anyone who did not know law. The water moved like a quiet thought. He had options, and each option had a cost. He could abandon the army and walk into Rome as a citizen. Trials would come fast. Loss of property, exile, or worse would follow. He could camp in Gaul and wait for luck. Luck rarely favored a man who sat still while rivals moved. He could step over the line and accept that Rome would call him traitor until he won or died. He measured those weights against time, against the men who trusted him, and against the work he had laid down across Gaul. Before that line, he had tried letters again. He proposed that he keep one legion and one province, while others shed emergency powers. He asked for a joint disarmament with Pompey. He offered pledges backed by tribunes loyal to him. The answers delayed, then hardened. The city was not in a bargaining mood. He visited each cohort and looked at faces he knew by name. He thought of winter marches and flooded fords, of cut hands on stakes, of quiet courage at midnight alarms. He thought of Julia and of Crassus, one tie cut by fate, the other by desert sand. He thought of his mother's council and the priest's house on the forum's slope. He tightened his cloak against a river wind. The night before the march, he slept little. He paced under low stars and listened to the soft grind of wheels in the wagon park. A sentry coughed. A horse stamped. The air smelled of wet leather and smoke. He understood that this step would break the old frame, even if he meant to rebuild it later. He did not pretend it was small. He did not move the whole army at once. He took a single legion, the 13th, lean and ready. The choice was practical and symbolic. One tight unit could move fast, take towns without sieges, and show the city that momentum was on his side. He preferred speed to bulk. He crossed the Rubicon in a gray dawn. The river's sound was no different from any other, but the law bound it to memory. Water slid around his calves. Mud sucked at sandals. The far bank came up quiet and close. He stood there a moment and looked south. He had turned a page that Rome could not unwrite. The first days moved like a knife through cloth. Towns opened gates. Officials fled ahead of him. He kept discipline hard and theft low. He needed to show Italy that legions could pass without ruin. He sent letters to councils that smelled of wax and cautious hope. He asked for grain and loyalty. He asked for both with a clean promise of order. Pompey and the consuls evacuated Rome for Capua, then Brundisium. They judged that time favored them in the east, where fleets and new legions could gather. They left the city cold and stunned. Shops shuttered. Temples closed gates. The Forum's stones held footsteps that echoed. He entered the capital without a fight and walked streets that smelled of dust and fear. He moved with soft hands. He opened the state's temples where public funds lay and took what he needed with visible records. He ordered that debts not be collected with sudden seizure during the crisis. He kept markets open and punished looters. He thought about impression more than applause. He had not come for a riot. He had come for control. He tried to trap Pompey at Brundisium. He sent detachments to block the harbor and pressed the town's gates. Fires flared on the water at night. Oars splashed inside the dark. Pompey slipped away on ships just ahead of Titan lines. He watched the last sail fade to a thin cut on the dawn. The sea smelled like loss and salt. Italy lay quiet behind him. He turned west to secure Spain, where Pompey's legates held strong forces. He traveled fast over winter roads and cut through snow that bone-deep cold made sharp. He spoke with city councils that clung to caution. He accepted surrender where offered and forced the issue where needed. He drew another line in his head. All of Italy, then Spain, then the East. Time anchors marked the slide. Julia died in 54 BCE. Crassus fell at Carrhae in 53. Pompey took the special command in 52. The ultimate decree passed in January 49. The Rubicon crossing followed days later. Each date cut a step into a slope he could no longer climb back up. He thought often about how this had formed. It was not one argument or one insult. It was a slow unraveling of ties, a tightening of laws, and the careful positioning of legions and ledgers. He had tried to write his way out and had failed. He had chosen to march his way out instead. The choice tasted like iron. He did not pretend that virtue alone guided him. Ambition guided him too, clear, calm, and strong. He wanted safety from hostile courts, but he also wanted the shape of Rome to fit his hand. He wanted to steer a state that had drifted into violence, delay, and show. He knew the price others would quote for such a claim. He accepted that risk and kept moving. The chapter closed with roads empty behind and ahead. The legion's nails rang like hail on cold stone. Italy had not bled, but the cut lay open. He had stepped across law's thin river and turned crisis into movement. He moved because stillness would have been a slower blade. Chapter 8. A knife without noise. He left Rome with the smell of cold dust still in his cloak. The streets had closed behind him like a book. The city did not bleed, but it had flinched. He would keep it that way, quiet, fast, and firm. Spain came first. Pompey's legates held veteran legions near the Ebro and the hills around Ilerda. Those men had good officers, clean camps, and strong pride. He aimed to break their plan without breaking their spirit. He drove west on winter roads that rang under nails. Wagons groaned. Mules steamed in morning breath. He moved light where he could. Few tents, strict loads, constant pace. The army learned that speed fed safety. Massilia tested his patience on the way. The old Greek port tried to stand neutral and leaned toward Pompeii. Its seawalls shone wet with spray. He left a siege behind, with men he trusted and pressed on. The siege would teach Rome that he could hold two ideas at once: storm and march. The Ebro's valley opened in long lines of brown and pale green. He approached Alerta and saw the ground at a glance: ridges, gullies, and a swollen river with changeable fords. The enemy held height and watched his dust. He walked the lip of a cut bank and counted steps aloud to settle his breath. Terrain would decide this fight. He built where others charged. Engineers drove piles for bridges that the flood tore away in the night. Men cursed and laughed and built again. The smell of wet rope and river mud clung to every sleeve. He moved grain along goat paths to feed men standing knee-deep in water. Logistics was war made plain. Skirmishes flickered along the slopes at noon. Lines met, broke apart, and melted into scrub. He kept the legions on short leashes and punished wasted valor. The point here was pressure, not glory. He wanted the opposing camp to feel time's weight. A sudden flood cut his supply line and trapped cohorts along the wrong bank. He felt a cold drop in his stomach and then steadied. He threw a new bridge higher upstream and marched fast at dusk. Torches hissed when they met the rain. He gathered his men before the enemy could bite. The narrow save taught both camps who could think under weather. He worked the ground with patient teeth. He cut a road around the enemy's left and pushed out a line of forts. He pulled water from the river into ditches to foul approaches. He added small towers where the slope bent. Each piece by itself seemed modest. Together they closed a lid. The opposing commanders, Afranius and Petreius, felt the ring tighten. They shifted camp toward the hills and found his men already there, cutting turf and sinking stakes. The hills smelled of time, crushed under sandals. Dust rose from every hammer stroke. The ring became a habit, not a boast. Food decided matters. He watched their foragers stretch further, then falter. He hit wagons when they turned too slow and left quiet gaps when they moved right. He signaled that surrender would mean life. He signaled that flight would mean thirst. The calculus settled on both tables. One gray morning, banners dipped in the other camp. Officers walked out, under guarded escort. They asked terms. He granted them with a steady voice and a clean face. He took their oaths and spared their lives. He did not wish to salt the fields he planned to farm later. Mercy, used well, became a tool that cut without noise. The legions under Afranius stacked arms with stiff backs. He stood where they could see him and kept his gaze level. He knew how anger smolders after a yield. He offered grain, then sent them home. He needed their memory more than their swords. The hills around Ilerda held their breath as the camps emptied. The air smelled of trampled grass and stale smoke. He wrote Rome. The letter listed dates and numbers, then the terms. It named no boasts. He wanted the Senate to find only facts when they searched for faults. He trusted that the people would read between the lines. They always did. Massilia still held out when the letter went south. Decimus Brutus, firm and clever, had pressed the siege by sea and land. Ramming prows thudded into hulls, towers crept forward on groaning axles. The city's confidence thinned. It yielded to process and was spared. He approved the settlement and kept the port intact. He needed harbors more than ruins. Not every line held straight. Curio, an ally sent to Africa, met King Juba and the Pompeian forces near the Bagradas in 49 BCE. His early success turned to ruin under a hammering cavalry charge. The survivors staggered back to the coast under a burning sky. The report reached him at dusk. He read by a small lamp that smoked and left a bitter scent. Loss marked the page. He absorbed it and moved. He told his staff that Africa would wait. He would take the main weight east. Spain was quiet behind him. Italy stayed open and fed his lines. He would strike at the heart where Pompey gathered senators, fleets, and pride. He counted ships and found too few. Rome required tending before the crossing. He entered the capital briefly and moved with care. The Forum smelled of warm stone and olives crushed in nearby stalls. He called the Senate to meet and spoke with dry respect. He sought office to secure law behind him, consul for the coming year. He accepted a short dictatorship, only to run the elections. He filled vacant magistracies and then set the power down. The gesture mattered more than the paperwork. He wanted to prove that command could touch law and let go. He eased debts with a measured edict. No sudden seizures during the crisis, no wild remissions that broke trust. He balanced creditors against the city's nerves. He paid his soldiers on time and kept prices framed with grain moving through Ostia. He preferred tension to panic. Panic broke carts and oaths. He visited the priest's house and stood in its cool court at dawn. Incense thinned in the air. He spoke the rites with steady tone. He had not forgotten the chair he held. Ritual and war had to share one face. He made sure they did. He returned to the coast where transport ships waited under winter skies. The Adriatic lay gray and chopped by wind. He chose to cross in January 48 BCE against season and caution. The decision matched his habit. Risk that moved, not risk that froze. He would force a foothold in Epirus and call the rest after. The first wave pushed off under muffled oars. The air tasted of salt and iron nails. He packed light. Few animals, hard biscuit, dry olives, and men who could march long on short rations. The bows rose and fell with ice-cold spray. He kept his cloak tight and his eyes on the eastern dark. Distance decided worlds. They landed near Paleste with numbed hands and cramped legs. Fire snapped against a raw wind. He walked the beach and counted heads in the wavering light. He sent scouts inland and found rough tracks leading toward Dyrrhachium and Pompey's larger camp. The ground smelled of wet stone and sheep. The campaign would begin on empty stomachs. He ordered a push along the coast to seize ports before fleets could pin him. He showed pressure more than possession. He wanted Pompey to show his hand early. Pompey had the ships, the granaries, and a cautious strategy that relied on time. He would try to make time feel thin. The fleet left behind tried to return for more troops. Storms slapped it back. Oars splintered, sails shredded. Sailors cursed the season and then the orders that sent them. The sea made its own law. He had to hold with what he had, 7 legions at most, understrength and underfed. He cut rations and wrote letters that asked for luck in the form of weather. He moved inland to find better ground and fresh water. The soil clung to sandals and gave under carts. Villages watched with narrow eyes. He paid for grain where he could and took it where he must, leaving tallies on wax. He did not want to march through a desert of his own making. He would need these tracks again. Pompey watched from higher hills with more of everything, men, mules, and ships stacked with grain sacks. He made clean camps that smelled of order and oil. He kept his legions rested. He sent cavalry to harry and scouts to count tents. He did not rush. Caution was his shape now, and it fit an army built to last. He drew lines around Dyrrhachium to choke Pompey's supplies and to force a decision. His men cut ditch after ditch until the fields looked like a map drawn in earth. Stakes went into trenches. Ramparts rose in tight segments. The labor ate whole days and left hands raw. The sea glittered beyond the ridges like something withheld. They worked anyway. Spring leaned in. The grass thickened on slopes chewed by hooves. Skirmishes popped like sparks along the lines. He tested weak points and saved strength where the ground bit ankles. Pompey replied with sudden lunges that tried to punch through the clay walls. One breach opened near the shore and widened under panic. He arrived with reserves and a flat expression. He plugged the gap and counted losses. He read the men's faces and felt their hunger. He wrote for ships again and for Mark Antony to push a second crossing. He asked for daring with a neat hand. The sea stalled and then yielded. Transports slipped through a watch and made for the coast with full loads. The moment reset the board. He gathered his scattered pieces and counted them twice. The air smelled of rain on dust. He pulled away from Dyrrhachium after a sharp reverse on the coastal flank. He would not grind a tired army against a rested one where the enemy had food. He marched eastward toward Thessaly, where fields spread wide and roads ran straighter. He aimed for ground that rewarded timing, not stockpiles. He still believed time could be broken into useful pieces. Anchors kept the slope clear. Illyrda and the surrender of Afranius and Petreius belonged to mid-49 BCE. Massilia yielded soon after. Curio fell in Africa that same year. He entered Rome, took a brief dictatorship to hold elections, and set it down. In January 48 BCE, he crossed the Adriatic and began the hard dance near Dyrrhachium. Each mark sat like a peg in the board. He kept his army moving to hide its hunger. He made short speeches that reminded men of winter marches in Gaul and of the bridges thrown over fast water. He gave bracelets and crowns with care and named men before their peers. He understood that honors have weight when bread is thin. He also kept his own counsel. He rode the column's length and watched feet as much as faces. Fatigue showed first in a gait, then in a stare. He let weak cohorts anchor easy ground and paired hard men with hills. He poured strength where the map asked and took from where it would not break. It was accounting with lives. Pompey followed with clean lines and better bags. He kept to rivers and road hubs. He accepted skirmishes and declined traps. He listened to senators who urged caution and to veterans who asked to fight. He tried to split the difference. Balance pleased Rome. It did not always win fields. The plain near Pharsalus opened under a white sun. The ground lay flat and dry, good for horses and clear for infantry to wheel. He measured the field with his eye and chose his spot with care. He would force an decision he could use and end a drift that killed by inches. The breath in his chest felt cold and sharp. He set a small reserve behind his right to meet cavalry that might try to sweep that flank. He felt the risk and chose it anyway. He lined cohorts in tighter depth than usual and told officers to hold their throws until close. Dust lifted and hung in a thin veil. The air tasted of chalk. He slept little the night before. He walked the picket lines and listened to low talk and the pop of damp wood in fires. He spoke softly to centurions and checked the pila shafts stacked by stakes. He looked east and gauged the light. He had carried a knife without noise across 2 years. Now the blade would show. The chapter closed on the edge of decision. His army stood hungry and ready. Pompey stood full and careful. The field lay bare and honest. He felt the sum of bridges, letters, and marches settle into one clear point. The next move would shift more than lines on a map. Chapter 9. Sun on dust, blood and water. Morning came bright and hard over the Thessalian plain. The light lay flat across stones and stubble. He measured the field and fixed his plan. The air tasted of chalk. Pharsalus offered space, not shelter. The ground was open, dry, and favoring a wide wheel. Pompey held more men, and more horse. He held calm. He would need both. He anchored his right with a hidden reserve. 6 cohorts waited behind the flank, set back and tight. He expected a sweep by cavalry. He meant to break it. His legions stood in deep ranks. Centurions checked pilot heads and leather ties. Shields shone in pale sun. He walked the line and counted steadiness. Pompey drew up with his horse and archers thick on their left. The plan seemed clear, even at distance. Sweep the flank, fold the line, finish with mass. Dust lifted in slow veils. He held his men still as the enemy advanced. He ordered throws late and aimed for close work. The first volley hit shields, the second hit arms. The crash went down the front like a drumbeat. Pompey's cavalry moved in a widening arc. Hooves tore dry turf. He felt the pull on his right and waited one breath more. Then he sent in the hidden cohorts. Their line hit hard at angles. Short swords worked where arrows missed. The horse line broke in knots and sought space. Archers behind them had nowhere to run. The battle turned on that pivot. His right held. The enemy's left sagged. He fed in reserves by small packets and pushed with hands kept low. The center felt the change and leaned forward. Dust thickened until men fought by shape. Sweat carried salt to mouths. The Roman habits, close order, steady feet, hard thrusts, went to work. The front rippled and then rolled. Pompey's infantry lost ground by feet, then yards. Pride kept them a while, fear pulled them more. Standards tilted back toward their camp. Shields clattered on stones. He watched for sudden fires and held back pursuit. Panic did the work now. He drove just enough and let disorder widen. The noise shifted from roar to fragments. Pompey quit the field when the road opened. His tent stood neat in defeat, empty of anything that might slow a flight. His chests were sealed. His mind had been ready to leave. He guessed that before he saw the cords. He called a stop before slaughter spoiled the proof. He wanted captives, not corpses. He wanted senators to live long enough to remember mercy. He thought of Rome's mornings after blood. The camp yielded bread, tents, and a clean table. He ate a small ration and drank water that tasted of tin. He slept an hour under coarse cloth. Then he wrote. He sent letters with plain facts, order of battle, losses, names spared. He asked cities along the coast to open harbors to men who fled. He put calm into ink. It steadied the day. Pompey headed for the sea and then to Egypt. The Ptolemaic court waited with its own storms. The year was 48 BCE. Alexandria floated on wealth and rumor. He knew both could drown a visitor. He followed with lighter steps and fewer men. He left a trail of messages for governors and allies. He wanted the East framed in order before he reached it. He knew how fast chaos ran when news was thin. The Nile air hit like warm silk. The harbor smelled of fish and cedar pitch. The lighthouse rose from the water like a second sun. He stood on the quay and studied faces. Ptolemy XIII ruled in name. Courtiers and generals ruled in fact. Cleopatra, his sister, was in the wind. The court wore gold on thin bones. It smiled and watched. Pompey arrived by small boat ahead of him. The boy king's ministers feared his name. They offered landing with soft words and sharp minds. They cut him down on the sand. The deed traveled the city in whispers that smelled of iron. He received the news at the water's edge. A basket held the proof nobody wanted to see. He kept his face still and let the sea wind clear the smell. Grief came in a hard line under his ribs. He had never liked necessity dressed as zeal. He entered the palace with measured courtesy. He offered thanks that closed no doors. He asked for debts owed to Rome and for wheat to feed cities. He asked for order. He planned for war. The city pressed close around the palace district. Alleys smelled of spices and night soil. Alexandrian crowds were quick to anger and slower to forget. He counted moods at markets by the pitch of talk. Cleopatra reached him at last by quiet routes. She sought a path back to power with speed and nerve. He saw a partner with reach, Greek learning, Egyptian symbols, and royal blood. The alliance formed with cold clarity and mutual need. War began in halls before it spilled into streets. He used palace courts as redoubts, and the harbor as spine. He burned ships to block ships. The smoke smelled of resin and salt. Firelight threw hard shadows on white stone. The Pharos Island became a knot. Whoever held it held the harbor mouth. Engineers ferried men under missiles and built housing for engines on narrow quays. The lighthouse loomed like a careful god. He cut a causeway to split enemy forces and drew them into tight ground. He set bolt throwers where alleys narrowed. He trained archers to watch for sudden fires. Water wagons trundled under shouts. Fighting turned to corners and stairs. Sand stuck to sweat on arms. The enemy shoved towers along streets. He answered with hooks and flames. The city learned to scatter at the sound of wheels. He suffered a near fall at the Heptastadion. A surge took the quay. Boats tangled. Men slipped on weed. He swam for a ship with armor gone and a cloak heavy as lead. The salt burned his nose. He reached a rope with torn hands and climbed. He did not overplay survival. He reset lines and made new maps. He noted which captains steadied when plans failed. He sent for grain, coin, and more engines. He kept his center quiet. Relief came from Syria with steady steps. Mithridates of Pergamum marched south with allied troops and spirit. He moved to meet him at the delta's edge and broke the siege from the outside. The city felt the change like a dropped weight. The last fights ran tight and brief. Ptolemy's forces cracked along canals and narrow banks. The king's body washed up downstream. Glitter turned to silt. Cleopatra took the throne beside a younger brother, as custom demanded. He accepted the form and focused on the function. He settled accounts fast. He rewarded helpful Greeks and careful Jews. He punished treachery by rule, not rage. He released back pay to key units and set guards at granaries. The city exhaled. The smell of smoke faded from the harbor. He lingered to stabilize the court and to secure wheat shipments. Time in Alexandria ran like its canals, slow until it flooded. He kept letters moving through storms that cut lines to the north. His office lay far away in Rome, but Rome's belly lay close at hand in Egypt's fields. Cleopatra bore him a son. Rumor turned that fact into a blazon. He did not shape policy around gossip. He shaped policy around ships, storehouses, and quiet roads to Syria. He left garrisons where the palace's breath could reach them. He left money where it would hold friends. The east still had fires. Pharnaces, son of Mithridates, pushed into Pontus and Armenia. He moved fast on half-ruins and called it victory. Local rulers bent in the wind. He turned from the Nile to the Black Sea with speed sharpened by pride. He marched lean through Asia Minor. Towns smelled of dust and incense. He found Pharnaces near Zela in 47 BCE, eager and overconfident. The field tilted in strange angles cut by low mounds and gullies. He studied it and adopted a short plan. He struck before the enemy finished forming. Cohorts advanced in clipped steps, Pila flashed, and then blades. The enemy line buckled at the seam of two commands. It became a rout in the time it takes a kettle to boil. He put the victory in 3 words for Rome: The report itself remained spare. He turned back west as if pulled by a cord. The Republic had tilted further while he had crossed water and sand. He needed Italy quiet, and his party aligned. He needed Rome to believe that near chaos could learn a new gate. Anchors held the sequence. Pharsalus belonged to August 48 BCE. Pompey's death followed within weeks at Alexandria's shore. The Alexandrian War ran through winter into 47. Zela closed quickly in summer 47. These dates sat like nails along a beam. He stepped again onto Italian soil and tasted wet wind. He paid arrears to veterans and promised land in concrete lists. He eased debts in steps, not in noise. He reopened courts with judges who knew speed. He meant to show that victory could carry law beside it. Veterans cheered, senators watched. Street gangs shrank under new orders. Grain ships docked and moved sacks by numbers. The city learned his rhythm and kept it for a while. He walked to the forum at dawn and listened for tone. It held. He accepted honors that piled too high. Dictator for a stretch, then longer. Consul again, seats of gold. Laurel wreaths that hid a thinning hairline. He wore what the moment handed him and tried to keep the edges plain. He failed partly because plainness cannot surround crowns. He looked often at maps, even inside Rome. Roads ran to Africa and Spain where the last hard pieces waited. He would go there soon with tired patience and a clean blade. He would finish what the plain at Pharsalus began. The chapter closed with water gone quiet behind him and roads rising ahead. He had won a field, crossed a sea, and bent a city that believed itself unbending. He had written his version of order into the east and returned with a calmer face. The next test would not measure engineering. It would measure endings. Chapter 10. Nets tighten at Thapsus. Winter light lay flat across the Tiber when he set plans for Africa. The city smelled of wet stone and smoke from green wood. He read lists until the wax went dull under his stylus. The last, hardest enemies gathered where the desert met the sea. Metellus Scipio, Pompey's former father-in-law, held Africa with senators and Numidian allies. King Juba, hard, proud, and heavy with cavalry, stood beside him. Labienus, once his sharpest lieutenant in Gaul, now rode against him with bitter skill. The line would not break by boast. It would break by weight and speed. He chose his generals with care. He sent veterans to Sicily to stage the crossing and kept engineers close. He gathered legions seasoned in Gaul and new levies drilled on Italian fields. He set supply lists by the day, not the week. Africa punished delay. The sea answered with winter moods. Swells pushed ships offline. Wind clawed canvas and spars. Tar and salt filled every breath. He waited for a narrow window and took it. He reached Hadrumetum in early 46 BCE with scattered transports. Men waited ashore with shields held high against waves. The sand sucked at ankles. The wind tossed grit into eyes. He formed ranks where the beach rose and pushed inland for space. His foes moved fast to contest the landings. Skirmishes flickered in dunes and among low palms. He held ground with short thrusts and constant spade work. Field fortifications grew out of sand like dry brush. The air smelled of brackish wells and trampled herbs. Supply set the rhythm. He sent cavalry wide to find water and ordered wells lined with stone. Grain trickled from coastal farms, thin but steady. He rationed tight without letting hunger eat nerve. The legions understood that patience sustained the blade. Utica's harbors glimmered north along a crabbed coast. Cato held the town as guardian for the senatorial cause. His rule was iron, fair, rigid, and unbending. He stocked granaries and hedged walls with fresh stakes. He kept books as keenly as he kept watches. He was the republic made into a man. He felt the shape of the campaign settle. Scipio had the main field army and Juba's horse. Cato held the port and treasury. Labienus ranged between, hunting mistakes. He would have to split their unity and press the center hard. He cut roads into the hard crust and walked the lines himself. Raspina nearly spoiled the start. Labanus met one of his columns with elastic cavalry and skirmishers who teased and pulled. The sun flashed on bronze as lines unraveled in dust. He studied the cohort fronts and closed ranks, then pushed in short pulses. The field recovered by force of habit and spine. The lesson wounded pride but sharpened caution. He answered with method. He built a chain of camps inland from Leptis and sent foragers under guard. He trained his light troops to shadow Numidian rides and trap them against rough ground. He refused any fight he could not define. He preferred a siege of options over a single throw. The season pressed forward. Scipio settled near Thapsus, a coastal town ringed by salt lagoons and low, hard banks. Earthworks sprouted on both sides. The lagoon smelled of rot and brine. He measured distances by pacing and set his own forts to bite. He drew a line of redoubts to pinch Scipio against the water. Ditches filled with salt seep. Stakes took hammer marks that blistered palms. Towers rose with wicker screens that rattled in onshore wind. His men moved with a rhythm learned in Gaul, cut, lift, pack, and tamp. The ground answered with stubborn weight. Cato watched from Utica and drilled men at dawn. He sent stern letters to Scipio, urging steadiness, thrift, and clean lines. He kept accounts of coin, grain, and bolts for engines. He meant to endure. He would not bargain what he believed the city had been. Juba's army camped inward, out of sea wind. Numidian horse stamped and snorted. Their nostrils steamed in morning chill. Scipio's elephants swayed behind palisades. Gray skins dusted with salt. Trumpets sounded and then went quiet. Both sides stood near lunge distance. He waited for an opening that came on a day of low haze. Scipio shifted to extend his line along a dry tongue of ground. The move promised a longer flank and threatened his nearest fort. It also left seams. He saw them. He sounded the attack before Scipio settled. Cohorts poured from gates and struck at the join between legions and elephants. Pila flew in thick arcs. The beasts buckled under pain and smoke. Some turned into their own men. The field became a mesh of thudding feet and iron. The smell of blood and dust filled the mouth. He pushed the center at a steady pace. No rush, no stall. The right bent forward like a hinge. Elephants tried to break through and died against fences of stakes and firepots. The left fixed Scipio in place with noise and smoke. The balance tipped. Trumpets on Scipio's line called a retire that became a run. Juba's horse wavered, then turned. The route to camp jammed with shields, carts, and falling men. He kept pursuit short. The ground near the lagoon was treacherous. Salt pans cracked under weight. He gathered prisoners and called the field. Thapsus broke the senatorial army as a single tool. Scipio fled to sea and then to a small island, where he chose death rather than the long play of mercy. Juba fled inland with Petreius. Their path ended in a grim pact between friends and rivals. The cause lost its main blade, but not its spine. Utica learned the news before sunset. The town's markets emptied, doors shut. Cato read the reports and folded them with slow hands. He sent orders for guards to keep order and for the treasury to stand. He did not change his face. He marched the army toward the port with measured pace. Dust rose behind columns, standards dipped and lifted. He posted units at gates and docks, then called for counselors. He chose an entry that did not crush pride. He still believed that shape mattered. He offered clemency by rule. Citizens who laid down arms kept property. Officers who swore to leave politics lived to keep their oaths. He wanted the city to resume its old breath. He knew how councils and markets recovered under safety. He had built that rhythm before. Cato withdrew from the forum into a private room with a few friends. He dismissed them kindly and set his house in order. He read Plato and sat very still. He closed the account of his own life with the same rigor he had applied to public sums. The night felt heavy even to men who had not loved him. The city smelled of lamp oil and sea wind. He learned the news before dawn. He walked to the empty colonnade and touched cold stone. He ordered that Cato be honored with care and that the town be kept from frenzy. He knew the simple Cato would become. He could not battle it with insults. He would battle it with order. He held swift hearings to settle property and civic ranks. He reopened markets with guards posted at angles that checked brawls. He ensured grain ships moved without accusation of theft. He left a governor with clear rules and limits. He did not want Africa to smolder under the ashes of one day. He turned at once to mopping operations. Thapsus had broken the main force. Lesser bands still waited. He chased them in short, clean movements. Cities that yielded received terms. Captains who fought needlessly died fast. He rewarded scouts whose reports saved days. Africa fell into line with a tired sigh. He measured the army's state after weeks in heat and salt wind. Sand creaked in greaves. Waterskins leaked, despite careful stitching. He rested units by rotation and sent the worn back to Sicily. He fed survivors well, barley, oil, and a slice of salted fish. He knew hunger stored anger. He wrote Rome with spare pride. He listed enemy leaders dead or fled, named towns pacified, and cited officers who steadied lines. He did not gloat over Cato. He wrote that the war had ended in Africa and that the state would find peace. He knew the sentence would not hold, but it mattered to write it. Spain rose next. News began in low notes after Thapsus and climbed fast. The Pompeian sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, gathered remnants in Hispania Ulterior. Labienus reached them with sullen experience. Southern towns turned hedgehog under their banners. Old loyalties and fresh fear pushed hands to spears. He felt the pull west like a cord. He could not leave a hard knot behind him while he rebuilt Rome. He prepared for a second long haul under a sun that baked men into brittle shapes. He set pay, shoe leather, and barley rations in neat lines. He demanded sound mules and spare nails. The road would break weak carts first. He returned briefly to the city to settle laws and show face. He kept ceremonies short and offices filled. He renewed the calendar work that would soon free farmers from shifting dates. He paid troops on time, and he posted schedules for debt cases. The forum's air smelled of cut laurel and damp paper. He moved through it as through a workroom. He did not let honors slow his pace. A new wreath, a new chair, a new decree of thanks. These he accepted with a small nod. He refused excess when he could, and trimmed phrasing when he could not. He knew how envy watches gifts. He would not tempt it more than necessity demanded. He sent letters ahead to Spanish towns. He promised safety to those who opened gates and measured mercy to those who hesitated. He warned against Labienus's counsel of delay and raids. He sketched the winter plan. March, starve, strike. He would use the map's open flats as he had used the plains of Thessaly. He would not repeat Dyrrhachium's lesson. Sextus taught trouble along the coast, with light ships and quick landings. He flagged ports at night and ran when horns blew. Gnaeus drilled infantry inland. Labienus tuned the cavalry to hit when dust rose and fade when shields formed. The three together made a moving storm. He obliged them together. He crossed into Spain in late 46 BCE with the old caution and new speed. The land opened in brown folds and ironstone ridges. The air smelled of thyme and warm dust. He split his force to secure river crossings and drew the enemy into watching two fronts. He did not announce where he would strike. He watched where they ran to block. The first set-piece engagements told him what he needed. His veterans kept order. The Pompeians fought with anger and long memory. Their cavalry knew his cavalry's bends. Their infantry had known his stare. The field acknowledged old debts. Winter slid into the edges of 45 BCE as both sides moved around Corduba and then Munda's plain. The ground there rose in a gentle swell that would favor whoever held it first. He walked its edge and pressed soil between thumb and finger. Dry. Firm. Punishing if one lost stance. He chose to close there. He ordered camps in lean lines and named posts by the hour. He tested the enemy's nerve with feints that nibbled at flanks. He watched how Labienus sent rescue signs and how quickly Gnaeus responded. He kept count, like an accountant who knows which debtor will crack first. He understood that Munda would take more than one clear push. Between drills, he kept his thoughts on Rome. The calendar reform neared completion. The Julian reckoning that would end drift and place sowing and harvest on stable rails. He saw courts running without bribes as their only fuel. He pictured colonies for veterans on safe lands that would hold roads together. He understood how much a single year in peace could do. Peace had to wait. Spain's dust waited first. He looked west at a sunset that threw copper light across the ridge. The camp murmured. Men mended straps and rubbed oil into stiff sandals. A mule brayed. The smell of boiled barley drifted low and steady. He felt the weight of years narrow to a single rise. Anchors held a line of time. Thapsus fell in early 46 BCE. Cato died at Utica days later. Spain stirred through late 46 and hardened toward Munda by early 45. These were marks that fixed a road across rough country. He trusted such marks. He had lived by them. He lay down on a thin pallet and slept in short pieces. Wind tapped at the tent's leather. He woke before dawn and listened to the camp breathe. He thought of Cato and of Scipio, of Labienus and of young men with sharp eyes and more anger than patience. He did not think of monuments. He thought of footing. The chapter closed with the nets tied inland and the last knot drawn tight. Africa had taught that speed and edges could cut elephant and horse alike. Spain would test patience on bare ground. He had sharpened both tools. He would need them in equal measure. Chapter 11, The Last Hard Field. Dawn came thin and colorless over the uplands. Frost clung to grass blades and turned breath to steam. He stood at the edge of camp and listened to the low clink of tools. The day would not forgive mistakes. The ridge at Munda rose with a steady back. It offered a clean line and little cover. The ground below lay firm and dry. He measured the slope with slow steps and marked where feet would slip. The Pompeian army held the rise. Gnaeus Pompeius stood with veterans and new levies, mixed in one long spine. Labienus, fierce and knowing, watched the flanks. Sextus moved behind the lines, quick and careful. The sun rang off spearheads and chilled hands. He formed deep ranks and anchored his wings on low folds. standards lifted in a cold breeze. Pila stood, stacked in tidy sheaves behind the front. He kept cavalry close, not wide. Spain had taught him how far dust could lie. The first push climbed the hill and stalled. Shields met stones and fell. Men slipped and rose with grit in their teeth. He pulled them back a little and reset the pace. The slope demanded patience more than heat. He tightened the line and sent a second push that pressed straight. The enemy's front bent without breaking. Labienus threw weight at his right and sought to turn the ground into rough steps. The clash sounded like iron on an anvil. Both sides held. He moved a cohort block behind his threatened wing. Their centurions had faces cut by Gaul's winters. They knew when to dig heels and when to bite. The line steadied, then gained a palm's width. He fed small reserves instead of one broad throw. The hill accepted slow coin. Hours stretched. The sun lifted and made helms burn to the touch. Sweat ran under armor and stung eyes. Dust rose and turned lungs raw. He rode the interior and watched feet. He placed strength where gates lost spring. The turn came on the enemy right. A shallow hollow there hid a dip in confidence. He saw Labienus signal a shift and felt a seam open. He sent a sudden thrust at that joint, short, sharp, and close. The front rippled. Gnaeus tried to stiffen his center with a forward step. That step left a thin skin over a low spot. His men found it with hard noses and short blades. The surface tore. Standards in the enemy line wobbled. He did not chase the wobble with noise. He sent one cohort to cut in at angle. Another followed, half a breath behind. The two together made a wedge and widened the rent. The hill's advantage fell away. The crest no longer belonged to one side. Labienus sensed the danger and galloped to rescue. He called for a switch that pulled men from the far flank. The motion crossed paths with his wedge at the worst point. Confusion overtook courage. An order died between dust and fear. The Pompeian line broke by sections. First the right slid, then the center bent, then the left gave ground in shouting clumps. He kept pursuit measured. He had learned what salt pans and loose stones did to hurry. The slope, once enemy, now aided his push. Labienus fell in the crush, cut down after years as a blade at his side. Gnaeus ran for the roads west, wounded and guarded by men who loved him. Sextus slipped into scrub and shadow. The field emptied under a hard blue sky. He called the halt. He hated slaughter after proof. Men stacked arms or lay silent with open eyes. The smell of iron and crushed time filled the air. He walked the line and named officers who had saved edges. He set burial details and water lines. He allowed no fires near powder-dry brush. He counted prisoners and set guards on carts. He ordered surgeons to both tents. He knew wounds did not ask allegiance. He wrote at once with a dull stylus and a steady hand. The year was 45 BCE. The letter named the ridge, the hour, the ends of men once central. It promised Spain a return to taxes, roads, and courts. It asked Rome for grain and silence while carts moved. The mopping followed, hard miles, thin water, and sudden knives from gullies. He sent light troops into bag ground with local guides. He paired veterans with young men who needed a cleaner death to live longer. He broke small bands and pardoned towns that opened gates. He spared where fear ran before him. Gnaeus's trail ran toward the coast and then inland again. It crossed dry streams and thorn beds. The men who carried him faltered. He was found at last near Lauro, hidden and spent. The blade that ended him closed a long ledger. He ordered a clean burial and forbade jeers. Mercy toward the dead kept the living calmer. Sextus vanished into hills with a few ships, coins, and bitterness. He would grow into trouble later along coasts and islands. For now he was a shadow that wind could move. He noted the fact and filed it under C. He had land to settle first. He disarmed towns by count, not rage. 1 in 10 weapons here, hostages from leading houses there. He protected markets from his own foragers and punished theft with speed. He allowed no speeches in squares, from men who had worn the wrong colors yesterday. He asked for taxes and grain, then coin. He stacked both by the road. His soldiers deserved rest and a name fixed to honor. He staged small ceremonies that gave bracelets and rings on cool evenings. He called names in front of ranks and fixed them into memory. He paid arrears where sums matched books. He sent worn men home on leave to farms that needed hands. Mercy for soldiers was statecraft too. He rode again to Rome and set his face toward Italy. He had fought enemies in fields, gullies, and courts. He had outweighted hunger and fought down anger. He had bent the map again and again until it held. He now stood alone with a problem that wore a city's name. He crossed the sea with calm weather and lucky tides. The decks smelled of pitch and old nets. Gulls kept pace until the coast rose clear. He stepped ashore and felt familiar damp in the wind. Italy still had its soft grasses and hard stairs. He entered Rome with ceremony held in tight hands. He allowed a triumph for Spain and formal processions for earlier wins, Captain Ledger. He climbed the Capitol steps under laurel. He kept his face plain under paint and gold. The crowd cheered as crowds do. The sound swelled and then thinned. He widened the honors he had already gathered. Dictator for a longer span. Consul again for 45 BCE. A chair that shone more than others. A laurel wreath that gave shade and rumor at once. The gifts felt like tools and traps together. He did not pause at the shine. He moved into work with low, quick steps. He audited grain accounts and cut waste he could see with a finger. He reopened courts and demanded steady calendars. He spoke to debt lists and eased them with careful rules. The city breathed a little easier. He began to release men from service and settle them on land. He chose colonial sites with access to roads and safe harbors. He sent surveyors who knew how to lay straight lines on rough soil. He wrote charters that gave guardrails to weak councils. He wanted veteran towns that could stand a bad winter and a bad neighbor. He planned a calendar reform that would carry his name. The Julian reckoning would pin months to the sun and keep sowing and harvest true. He found astronomers with clean tables and ears for instruction. He made time itself a road that ran straight. The old drift would end. Dates would hold. He wrote laws against corruption with language people could read. He laid out juror lists that turned slower and paid better. He trimmed guild power where it fed street brawls. He posted notices high enough to meet eyes and low enough for hands to touch. He believed in the daily weight of order. He also filled the forum with signs of a single hand. Statues rose and inscriptions multiplied. A special chair at games. A crown on a coin. A priesthood title, stretched thin. A name spoken first. He accepted forms that kept enemies quiet and tested friends' limits. He tested his own. He received embassies from towns that hoped to be forgiven for late loyalties. He smiled and nodded and stacked their gifts by value and use. He wrote lists of grain they could ship by season. He wrote lists of men they could send to fill thin units. He held their eyes just long enough to settle fear. He met the Senate often and spoke in spare lines. He wanted them to act and then own what they had done. He called sessions on time and ended them without flourish. Senators resented him and relied on him. They liked quiet streets and hated the price. Their faces said both. He walked at dusk along the Palatine's edges and listened for the city's old song. Wheels on stone, vendors closing stalls, boys running toward home on scarred feet, the smell of smoke and stew. He knew he was turning the song into something cleaner and harder. He did not know where it would stop. He read lists late into the night by lamplight. He marked names for promotion and for exile. He balanced veteran settlements against treasury sums. He noted which men could stay near Rome and which must be sent to distant tasks. He kept the machine oiled and moving. He sensed that stillness would make it break. Time anchors gave shape to this stretch. Munda fell in March 45 BCE. Gnaeus died soon after. Sextus escaped. He returned to Rome that same year and took new honors. The calendar reform flowed into 46 to 45 BCE and would lock in 45 to 44. These dates stood like stakes in soft ground. He thanked gods in ritual tones and kept the rites exact. He moved through temple smoke with a careful step. He set feast days and cleaned neglected shrines. He knew how public sight anchored private doubt. He did not give easy targets. He also knew the bill for victory had not yet come due. Men in white-bordered togas watched him with polite faces and cold eyes. They saw one man's name above many offices. They feared what came next if he left the city leaderless. They feared what came next if he did not. Fear drew knots. He tried small gestures to ease pride. He stood for senators when they entered. He refused titles that sounded like kingship, at least at first. He let others speak the word republic while he ran its bones. He gave clemency to old foes in public view. He hoped gratitude might root. He had learned how shallow soil could be. He kept to simple rooms when the day ended. He ate plainly and slept short. He woke before dawn and read reports with a cloak around cold shoulders. He trained his voice for quiet halls, not crowds. He wrote more than he spoke. He trusted paper to carry tone where mouths twisted it. He still felt fatigue from Spain in his calves on some mornings. He kept writing to clear the fog. He crossed the Tiber at first light and watched barges slide under low bridges. The river smelled of damp rope and silt. He thought about how fast water wore stone. The chapter closed with the city calm and the victor alone. He had ended a war that had scattered across islands, deserts, and plains. He had gathered laws and grain into a working shape. He had made the calendar hold. He had also drawn all weight toward one point. That point was strong and brittle. Chapter 12. Crown of paper, edge of steel. Rain glazed the paving before dawn. He crossed the forum under a hood and felt cold water gather at his collar. The basilicas loomed like ships in gloom. He carried lists in his sleeve and a calendar in his head. Work began at the root, time itself. Rome's year had drifted for generations. Priests stretched months for politics. Farmers guessed at seasons. He gathered astronomers and fixed the sun's track to law. The Julian reckoning would hold sowing and harvest to steady rails. It would begin in 46 to 45 BCE and settle by 44. Markets would mark dates without fear. Time would no longer be a tool for factions. He signed the reform with spare words. Wax cooled on the seal while rain ticked on the sill. He felt the quiet pleasure of a straight line drawn where others left smears. It was the kind of victory he trusted. He moved next to grain. Hungry streets turned praise into anger without warning. He audited storehouses and routes from Ostia. He cut middlemen, who padded weights and shortened sacks. He kept prices within reach by moving ships and posting schedules. The wharf air smelled of salt and rope tar. Carts rolled at dawn. Debt stood behind many faces. He weighed mercy against markets and wrote rules that eased interest without breaking credit. No wild cancellations, no sudden seizures. Property lists stayed intact. Bailiffs learned new limits. He preferred edges that rounded corners quietly. Loud gifts failed faster. He ceded colonies for veterans on good ground. Surveyors paced straight lines across soil that clung to their sandals. Plots touched roads and water where possible. He gave charters that protected councils from local predators. The towns began to breathe on their own. That breath kept legions loyal when the city's mood shifted. He rebuilt the Senate's body even as he bound its hands. The chamber had bled during civil war. He filled seats to a larger count with new men from Italy and provinces. Merchants, municipal leaders, and veteran sons took curule benches. Old families sniffed at new togas. The smell of fresh wool and bruised pride mixed under the high roof. He did not hide his face from courts. He sat often and listened long. He fined extortioners who had worn his colors only months before. He demanded clean ledgers from governors and returned stolen coin when records allowed. He ordered punishment when proof held. Mercy stood near but not in front. The halls smelled of ink and lamp smoke. Juries learned punctuality. He wrote laws that read like instructions rather than hymns. Road contracts posted in public. Milestones set by measure. Guilds trimmed where they bred street muscle. Lotteries turned to assignments with names and dates. Notices hung at eye height. A clerk could explain each line to a porter. He asked for that test and used it. He kept religion steady. Rites landed on right days under the new calendar. Temples saw repairs without gaudy touches. He consecrated new priests and moderated old claims. Incense drifted in clean spirals. He stood as Pontifex Maximus with plain hands, steady, exact, unafraid of smoke. He tried to share motion with a Senate that had forgotten how to move. He called sessions on time and held them to business. He listened to careful speeches and dull warnings. He answered with work, not quarrel. He granted honors to soothe pride. A statue here, a decree there. He withheld crowns that broke skin. For a while it seemed enough. Honors still gathered like snow on a low roof. Consul again. Dictator, then dictator for a longer span. Seats of gold at games. A laurel wreath that shaded thinning hair and prompted talk. His portrait on coins, with titles and tight rings. The city praised because the city wanted calm. Praise hardened into habit. He trimmed display when he could. Triumphs queued for wins that had come years apart. He compressed them into a single season and kept the processions tight. Ivory chariots rolled, prisoners marched, the capital took its due. He wore the paint and the laurel, and then went home early. He ate plainly after grandeur, as if correcting a sum. He kept clemency as a banner and a tool. Old foes entered his atrium with lowered eyes. He lifted them and spared their names. He returned estates to some and offices to a few. He allowed enemies to live long enough to speak of mercy. The gesture shaped rumor and bought time. Mercy, like iron, bent only so far. He watched the city's nerve from small places. A baker's line at dawn. A money changer's booth at noon. A veteran's meeting in a shaded portico at dusk. He listened to how voices carried. He tracked which words made shoulders relax. He preferred numbers, but tone told him more. Tone warned before facts did. He wrote often, less to persuade than to fix direction. Notes to magistrates came with short verbs. Letters to allies named sums and dates. Provincial instructions fit on one wax tablet. He cut clauses until the message walked on its own legs. He had no appetite for purple. He returned to building. The Forum of Caesar rose with clean lines and a calm facade. Stonecutters complained that he measured joints with a soldier's eye. He accepted the complaint. The space held markets and courts where rain could not bully them. The soft grit smell of fresh-cut limestone drifted for months. It felt like proof in stone. Rumor made longer turns around him now. Some claimed he aimed at kingship, an old word that bit ears. He wore a wreath. He sat first. He spoke over others' shoulders. He denied crowns and dodged titles even as they brushed his skin. He sensed how words could harden into a weapon. He preferred to blunt them, not challenge them. It worked until it did not. He tested the limits of spectacle at the Lupercalia. The day smelled of goat hide and crushed laurel. A crown appeared in public hands. He waved it away with steady fingers. The crowd cheered both the offer and the refusal. He felt heat from both. He knew heat warped wood. He wondered about stone. He did not shed speed while he watched. He planned Parthia, a long eastern war to erase Carrhae and finish a line Crassus had broken. Roads, depots, and river fleets crowded his mental map. He named legates and timed marches by season. He meant to leave in 44 BCE after settling the calendar and debts. He believed that distance would cool Rome and elevate purpose. He believed movement would keep knives sheathed. He filled the year's offices in careful order. The consulship for 44 would share his name and mark law's continuity. Lesser posts went to men who had earned more than they asked. He sent seasoned officers to provinces that needed calm, not zeal. He placed a steady man at Ostia. Grain would not fail on his watch. He still walked at dawn along the Palatine's edge. The city sounded softer now. Fewer brawls, more carts with grain, calmer cries in markets. He could smell bakeries before he turned the corner. He took comfort from heat against a cold morning. He thought of Gaul's winters and Spain's dry hills and felt age in his calves. He kept a private discipline that matched public order. He rose early, read, wrote, and heard cases. He ate bread and fruit more often than roast. He trained his voice low and steady. He slept short and deep. He carried fatigue like a familiar weight. It warned him to choose leverage over force. A small law about magistrates' travel times occupied him for an hour one day. The rule would keep governors from arriving late and claiming confusion. It would stop fraud by calendar trick and prevent extractions on local councils. The clause was dull, and the effect would be large. He liked such work. It kept breath in the state. He gave land to veterans near colonies that could anchor roads. He allowed a few theaters and baths to rise where crowds needed release. He set maximum building heights in dense streets to let light touch lower rooms. He believed that health grew in places that felt clean. The city responded with longer tempers. He watched the faces of spared men when they visited. Some showed gratitude edged with shame. Others showed calculation dressed as thanks. A few showed cold patience. He made a list of those. The list grew slowly. He did not imagine the list complete. Cleopatra visited Rome with her court's sheen. The Tiber air smelled of foreign perfumes for days. Crowds pressed at corners to glimpse her litters. He hosted with measured honors and careful distance. He listened to Senate breath grow short. He judged rumor's reach and limited its food. He did not explain. He moved on. He accepted titles, layered on titles. Father of the country, prefect of morals, dictator set without a clear end. He pretended that names were tools only. He sensed that names can make shapes harden. He kept telling himself that law could hold form without breath. He knew better and kept walking. He planned triumphs for Parthia as one plans timetables, not parades. He checked river levels months ahead. He sketched pontoon trains that could outrun desert wind. He wrote marching orders that accounted for sun angle and shade. He felt the old thrill of a problem he could solve with measure. Rome, by contrast, defied measure. He met the Senate in a mood that felt like thin ice. He greeted men by name and offered seats. He spoke of courts, roads, and corn. He named the date for departure east. He set a schedule for festivals and tax auctions that would keep the city breathing in his absence. Faces nodded. Eyes did not warm. He left a will in tidy clauses, money to the people, gardens to the city, adoption that would name an heir. He wrote the lines with a dry pen and a clear head. He imagined the paper outliving him. He hoped it could steer tempers when his voice could not. He held a census with swift methods, counting citizens and property with forms he had tested in provinces. He trimmed waste in grain accounts that vanished into soft hands. He moved idle men to road crews and canal clearing. He tried to turn discontent into wages. The riverbanks smelled of cut reeds and wet clay. Shovels rang. He pardoned again where it promised peace. He banished a few too dangerous to hold near. He handed lifetime seats to some and lighter posts to others. He kept balance with a finger's feel, not a scale certainty. He knew the difference. He knew how quickly fingers miss. Anchors kept his mind ordered. Calendar reform lived in 46 to 44 BCE. Dictatorship lengthened in those same years. Lupercalia's scene belonged to February 44. Parthian plans pressed the spring. These marks ran like nails through the board. They steadied him and warned him. He sensed shadows collecting in corners, men who had dined at his table and held his pardons. He imagined their talk in porticos at dusk. He pictured their phrases and their fears. Kingship would be the spoken word. Chains would be the felt one. He could not sit in every doorway and moderate breath. He answered with more law. He wrote rules for provincial courts that cut appeals into fixed lanes. He made municipal charters easier to read. He cut tax farming where it bent men to greed. He posted decrees where they could not be faked by chalk at dawn. He wanted the city to run, even when hate ran. He built for a future where he was absent. He ate in public with simple plates and allowed the crowd to see. He wore boots worn for marches rather than embossed leather. He kept the laurel on for headaches that had grown worse with years. He refused a diadem again in private hands and made the refusal known. He could not mute every rumor. He could only make their pitch hoarse. He sat late one evening with reports stacked high. Outside, a light rain whispered on tiles. The lamp's oil smelled faintly of olives. He rubbed a thumb along a table edge worn smooth by 1,000 plans. He felt the city settle for the night. He also felt it settling like snow on branches already bowed. He left instructions for morning, audience times, a note to a road crew near Tiber, a reminder for a small debt case that had stuck. He marked a ceremonial date on the new calendar and smiled despite himself. The numbers looked right. The numbers held. He slept and woke before light. He walked through the atrium, past the small pool that mirrored a dark ceiling. Footsteps whispered in the outer court. Rome breathed in its sleep. He drew his cloak close against a draft that came from the open vestibule. He reached for a list and tucked it deeper into his sleeve. He believed that work could keep fear thin. He believed that clemency could cool anger, that schedules could tame pride, that time held straight would anchor men to law. He had been right often enough to trust those beliefs. He did not stop trusting them now. The chapter closed on a city ordered and uneasy. Calendars held, courts turned, grain moved on time. Statues rose and eyes narrowed. Crowds cheered and whispers sharpened. He had wrapped power in paper and ritual. Paper and ritual could tear. The next day would test what still held. Chapter 13, Knives in Daylight. March moved in with clean mornings and cautious voices. The air carried a wet chill after rain. He woke early and set his day along the new calendar's rails. The list in his sleeve felt light. Rome did not. Talk thickened under porticos and in shaded courtyards. Men who had eaten at his table took longer routes home. They paused too long at corners and chose companions by habit, not chance. The city remembered old words, tyrant, king, freedom, and found new edges for them. He held to work and believed that routine could steady breath. Cassius moved among old friends with a dry smile. He had fought at Carrhae and had not forgotten either the sand or his pride. He gathered names like kindling, small, dry, and ready to catch. Brutus, stoic and careful, came slowly, pulled by duty as he saw it and by voices that reminded him of lineage. Decimus, reliable in war, carried easy access to the house and the man. Others drifted close, some for belief, some for fear, some for envy in neat togas. They met at dusk in gardens where water murmured against stone. They met in atriums where lamplight turned faces amber. They spoke of words first, titles and precedents, and the old kings driven out generations ago. Words hardened into plans when someone named a day. They chose the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BCE, a Senate session at the Theater of Pompey. The curia in the Forum was under repair. The theater's curia offered space, light, and exits. They learned his patterns. He dismissed bodyguards with a public gesture weeks before, trusting clemency in the air of calm. He walked with a short escort and a longer list. He answered warnings with thanks and moved on. He did not live behind doors. He disliked the smell of fear on a man's cloak. Omens multiplied as they always did when a city held its breath. Priests read odd livers. Birds flew in wrong lines. Whispers stretched those shapes into meaning. He accepted a few delays for ritual and then reset the schedule. He believed habits kept shadows thin. He was right until he was not. The conspirators argued over methods, with low voices and steady hands. Some wanted wider killings. Antony first, then others who might rally the street. Brutus pressed for a single stroke. He wanted to separate a body from a state and keep the idea of the republic intact. They compromised on blood limited to one man. It felt clean in a garden. It would feel different on stone. They drilled their part like a parade drill. One would present a petition. Others would circle and set hands on shoulders and arms. Blades would come from short sleeves. The space around the chairs had to feel casual and then close fast. Decimus would ensure the day held to plan. He sent messages that nudged the morning onto the track. The notes smelled of wax and rush. He rose on the Ides to a city still damp from night mist. The house was quiet. Servants moved in soft steps. He looked over lists and set the day in order. Hearings, audiences, a session with the Senate at midday. He had planned to leave for the East within weeks. The schedule gave him comfort. It always had. Calpurnia worried in words and signs as the morning lengthened. The household paused and then resumed. Decimus visited early, with mild insistence that the Senate waited and that delay would sour allies and embolden rivals. Duty pressed from two directions. He chose the familiar weight and walked. The theater of Pompeii stood broad and cool under a high sky. The stone smelled faintly of salt blown in from the river and of old cedar oil rubbed into benches. Senators gathered in white-bordered togas and held their faces in order. The hall carried a low, constant buzz. Trebonius caught Antony at the entrance with soft talk and kept him there. A small pause at the right door mattered more than a large speech inside. He took his place. The room held clean light that made dust visible in thin bands. He sat, lists tucked in his sleeve, and let the session begin its usual slow turn. A senator approached with a petition about an exile and stepped too close for etiquette. Hands touched his shoulders in what looked like courtesy. A small tug on his robe broke the frame. The first blade found cloth and then skin. It surprised more by location than by pain. He rose halfway in reflex and felt a second thrust, then a third. The circle folded tight and moved in jagged rhythm. He turned, trying to step out from the bench, and saw faces he knew in a painter's blur, intent, pale, and trembling at the work of their own hands. The noise in the hall changed pitch. He reached for a man he trusted and found air. Stabs came high and low, some glancing off bone, some slicing at the forearms he raised. Blood made stone slick. He took a deeper cut near the ribs and felt breath shorten. He backed toward the base of Pompey's statue as the ring pressed tighter. The irony belonged to others. He read only the floor, the world narrowed to tilt and thump. He sank sideways onto steps that had been polished by years of sandals. The smell of iron thickened. Motion around him slowed as fear matched zeal, and hands grew clumsy. Many wounds found their marks and then found them again. The list slid from his sleeve and lay half unrolled beside him. The writing blurred at the edges. He stopped moving. Silence arrived in hard beats, then broke as men stumbled back, blades wet, shoulders heaving. The hall smelled of sweat, blood, and lamp smoke that someone had knocked loose. Senators pressed against walls. Others fled. A cry of freedom rose thin and unsure under the curved roof. It sounded like a script read through once and not learned. Outside, the sun shone. Word ran before voices found order. People scattered, then gathered, then scattered again. Shops pulled shutters. Slaves rushed to doors. Riders went for country villas with urgent faces. The city remembered riot and feared it. The sound of sandals on stone took on a hurried drum's beat. Inside, the body lay where daylight touched it in a long rectangle. Attendants returned with faces drained of color. They lifted cautiously, wrapping him in a cloak sticky with blood. Steps to the litter clattered, as if the house itself trembled. They carried him along streets that had watched him rise, and now watched him pass. Antony left the doorway where Trebonius had kept him and felt the tilt in the street. He judged the immediate risk and moved toward safety. Lepidus, a solid man with cavalry and slow ambition, brought troops close to the city. The pair measured their steps and weighed whether to chase, parley, or wait. Waiting felt like control. The conspirators walked out into air that felt too bright. They raised voices about liberty and the republic restored. Swords lifted to a day that had not asked for them. Few cheered. Some watched from doorways with faces tight. When blood still glistened on steel, words about freedom found little purchase. They had planned the cut. They had not planned the days after. The body reached his house. The atrium felt cold despite lamps. Curtains hung motionless in doorways. Servants moved with the technical care of men who feared both gods and men. They laid him on a simple couch. The laurel still on his head held a scent that did not fit the room. A secretary smoothed the edge of a list that had fallen in transit and did not read it. News moved through tribes and guilds by afternoon. Men whispered tally marks. How many wounds? How many names? How many titles ended? Some counted debt cancellations that might vanish with his breath. Others counted favors due that would now be called in with harder terms. Grain still moved from Ostia. Carts still lined up by habit. Routine fought panic and held it to a draw. The Senate tried to gather sense in a night-thick room. Voices rose, proposed, retreated. Letters went out to commanders to hold, not move. Antony felt his way toward a line that promised peace without admitting fear. He offered amnesty to the killers and offices to himself. He knew tempers cooled for a price. He named it. Brutus and Cassius hesitated between the capital, where they had fled, and their own houses, where safety was thin. They chose ritual ground and then realized ritual did not feed a city. They wrote to magistrates in official tones. They read their own words twice and found little comfort. The night smelled of wet stone and hours that would not pass. The next morning drew a larger crowd. Antony stood and spoke under the high roof of the Forum's basilica. He praised the dead with words that felt both careful and warm. He promised calm. He placed himself between panic and revenge. He released no fire with his tongue. Not yet. The will was opened. Money to the people. Gardens to the city. Adoption that named a young man, Octavian, as heir. The lines had been written with a thin pen and now cut with thick force. The crowd murmured in a rhythm that had moved with him since the trials of his youth. Gratitude stirred under fear. The room warmed. The city leaned. The funeral cast its own weight over streets that remembered triumphs. The beer moved through ranks that swelled and pressed. The smell of pitch and fresh-cut wood rose from the pyre. Few knew who gave the first push. Many helped. Fire climbed faster than authority could follow. The noise grew from murmur to howl and bent toward the houses of men whose names were in every rumor. Antony struggled to keep lines from breaking. The city tasted how quickly grief can turn to heat. The conspirators left by side roads and shadows. Some aimed for provincial commands, some aimed for quiet villas, some aimed for ships. Each carried a lineage, a story, and the wrong wind at his back. They had killed a man to save a form. Forms need breath. The breath had gone. He lay in quiet as fire and ash took their last shapes. The lists he had kept lay in drawers and in mines. Grain ships would still need wind. Courts still needed dates. Roads still needed gravel and men. The calendar would hold. Time did not grieve. People did. Anchors fixed a year that had moved with awful speed. The Ides fell on March 15th, 44 BCE. The will opened days later. The funeral's heat changed the city's pitch within a week. Antony, cautious and quick, found his tone. Octavian, 19 and thin, began his slow walk toward wait. Lepidus brought horses to gates at evening and waited. These were the marks that would not wash out. He had believed that schedules could tame fear, that clemency could cool anger, that steady law could move a city away from sharp edges. He had been right often enough to make faith reasonable. He had also drawn weight to a single point until the frame creaked. The blade had taken the point and left the weight behind. The theater of Pompeii stood silent once the floors were washed. Light still fell in bands from the high windows. Dust motes still turned in those bands, as they always had. Men walked there with lowered voices. The noise in their heads did not lower. The forum returned to measured steps in pieces. Auctions resumed. The tribunals opened. Cartwheels sang on stone at dawn. The smell of damp wool returned to lines at bakeries. The people watched the rostra for clear speech. Clarity came in fragments. Antony sent laws through with a steady hand and a careful eye for rumor. Lepidus held positions that controlled gates and roads. Octavian arrived and moved in silence that made older men uneasy. Senators toggled between fear and calculation and found no safe stop. The city stood on a ledge and looked both ways. In the house on the forum's slope, Aurelia's old room sat empty. The pool in the atrium kept water clean and quiet. A scroll lay where it had been left, notes for a march east that would not occur. A small wax tablet corrected a figure in a grain schedule. The numbers looked right. They always had. The chapter closed with daylight on polished stone, and the city listening to its own echo. A single life had anchored schedules, roads, courts, and armies. That anchor was gone. The weight remained. Men would scramble to claim it, shape it, and survive under it. The Republic had survived many storms. This one had carved the shoreline itself. Chapter 14. Ashes, Inheritance, and a New Sun. Smoke drifted above the forum for days. The city breathed through curtains and half-closed doors. The ash from one fire settled on roofs that had watched many. Rome learned how absence could fill a street. He had left money to the people and gardens to the city. He had left a name, a calendar, and a plan for distant war. He had also left a quiet adoption. Gaius Octavius made Julius by will. The paper spoke when the voice could not. Octavian came along the coast in soft weather. He was 19, slight, and careful. He carried letters, a few friends, and the calm of someone who read rooms before he spoke. He stepped into a city that measured boys first by names. Antony held the most immediate weight. He knew the legions, the streets, and how to work a crowd. Lepidus sat astride the gates with horses and men who liked routine. The Senate waited for wind, with faces set to neutral. Each watched the others with polite nods. Octavian moved quietly. He visited houses that mattered and listened more than he asked. He paid soldiers the bequests promised in the will with money raised at speed. He noted who took the coin with thanks and who took it with a frown. He learned warmth from small things. Summer slid into autumn in 44 BCE. Antony tried to run the state as if nothing had changed. He faced law with one hand and rumor with the other. He read the people well, but read the Senate badly. He overplayed patience and then force. He made room. Octavian built a base without noise. He courted veterans from Caesar's old legions and the younger men in Rome's tribes. He reminded them of the name he had inherited and the money he paid on time. He promised nothing wild. He simply promised order. Brutus and Cassius drifted east. They gathered troops and respect from governors who wanted safety. They marched under the word liberty and raised funds under the word necessity. Their letters sounded like old Rome. Their camps looked like any camp. By early 43 BCE, Rome leaned toward a new arrangement. The Senate tried to use Octavian to check Antony. They gave him legal cover and then offered slow thanks. He saw how quickly allies turned into obstacles. He accepted their help and refused their leash. Mytilene set the pattern. Antony besieged Decimus in northern Italy. 2 consuls with Octavian's aid broke the ring. The field belonged to 43 BCE and cost the lives of both consuls. Victory left the boy with soldiers and no masters. He edged his chair forward without saying so. The second triumvirate formed soon after. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus took formal power for 5 years, then more. They listed enemies and posted names. Proscriptions followed in a wave that smelled of ink and fear. Old debts found bitter payment. Cicero fell in that black harvest. His head and hands went to the rostra where he had spoken so well. Rome flinched, and then adjusted. Octavian marked the moment and learned how far necessity could push a city. He did not forget the taste. The triumvirs moved east to face Brutus and Cassius. The plains near Philippi waited behind marsh and low hills. Autumn of 42 BCE brought twin battles under a thin, bright sky. The dead lay in long lines across stubble. Brutus fell last, a quiet end to a tidy mind. The word liberty did not hold a line that day. The spoils carved 3 spheres. Antony took the east with its wealth and wars. Lepidus received Africa with a smaller shadow. Octavian kept Italy and the scarred center. Land claimed for veterans, taxes gathered from towns that dreaded them, and a city that wanted calm without cost. He accepted the hardest peace. He settled veterans as the will required. He found land by force, purchase, and weary bargains. Towns groaned. Fields changed hands. He paid soldiers and stored resentment. The work smelled of dust and legal wax. It also built an army that would follow him west or east. He married and remarried to cut and tie alliances. He learned the limits of family as tool. He learned the limits of love as cure. He found Livia sharp, poised, and steady. She brought a small son and a composed mind. Their house would become a quiet center. Sextus Pompeius, with ships and bitter skill, took the sea. He harried coasts, cut grain lines, and made ports dread the horizon. Rome felt hunger waves, washed through streets like fever. Octavian lacked naval strength and the right admirals. He lacked time. Agrippa grew beside him in these years, loyal, inventive, tireless. He built ports, trained crews, and cut new channels near the Bay of Naples. He fought Sextus ship to ship and taught the fleet to think as one. Now Locus, in 36 BCE, broke the pirate king's hold. The city's belly relaxed. Relief tasted of salt and smoke. Lepidus tried to move on Sicily after the victory and found himself cornered. His troops drifted to Octavian at a gesture. Lepidus lived and lost power. The triumvirate became a pair. The map simplified. The stakes rose. Antony drifted toward Cleopatra's orbit. The East tempted with parade, coin, and old names. He won and gave and celebrated. He also spent. He linked his future to Egypt's queen with a public face. Rome took note. Rome had a long memory for crowns and a short tolerance for foreign gods when nervous. Octavian played patience. He kept the city fed, the courts open, and the tribes quiet. He published Antony's donations to his children as if they were charges. He read wills that named Alexandria first. He framed fear with documents and turned rumor into proof. He made moderation look like courage. He also built for war. Grain moved in deeper stores. Harbors readied more ships. Roads saw garrisons at bridges. He trained legions with drills cut to the edge and kept pay exact. He filled officer ranks with men who had shown steadiness at sea and on walls. Agrippa knitted it together. The Senate moved at last. They stripped Antony of offices and named Egypt as enemy. The mountain had taken years to turn. It turned with a long push. Octavian let it seem slower than it was. He liked structures to claim victory. Actium lay ahead, 31 BCE, in a bay on Greece's western edge. Antony and Cleopatra held the inside. with ships long and high. Octavian and Agrippa held the mouths, with crews drilled and oars timed to signals. The plain nearby baked under late summer heat. The sea held its own wind. The fleets met under a bright, hard sun. Signals flashed from poles. Drums beat. Oars pulled water into sheets. Fireships tried and failed. Rams glanced and bit. The fight turned on endurance, angles, and a single sudden move. Cleopatra's squadron cut free and ran for the open sea. Antony followed. His line saw the gap and wavered. Agrippa drove in. Smoke lifted in greasy pillars. Broken hulls burned where they drifted. Captains chose surrender by the dozen once commanders fled. The wind shifted and showed a wide blue emptiness. Actium did not end with slaughter. It ended with departure. That was enough. Octavian moved slow after that, which meant fast for Rome. He took Athens, then Asia, then Egypt's gate. The Nile Valley yielded with few cuts. Antony's last forces clung to honor and fell. Cleopatra ended her life behind locked doors. Alexandria sighed and adjusted to a new tone. The lighthouse still burned. He stood in the city of grain and cool courtyards and felt the door to the old world close. He did not squeeze it shut. He simply let it settle. He dismissed armies where it was safe and kept others near. He sent word that taxes would be fairer and that governors would be watched. He knew that calm feeds on simple promises kept. He returned to Rome through a season of measured triumphs. He kept the parades orderly and the speeches short. He set Egypt's wealth to work without making the city feel conquered by it. He closed the temple of Janus, the doors that signaled peace across the empire. The hinges had not cooled often. He studied titles as if they were tools. Dictator tasted wrong to every ear. King was poison. Imperator felt military and narrow. He accepted princeps. First citizen, because it sounded like order without claim. He accepted Augustus in 27 BCE, because it sounded religious without threat. Names can guide nerves. He rebuilt institutions with a carpenter's patience. He trimmed the Senate's numbers and raised its dignity where he could. He created offices that managed grain, fire, water, and roads. He laid out career paths that rewarded competence more than noise. He wanted a state that ran without crisis as its fuel. He kept armies on the frontier and small detachments near Rome. He paid troops on time and rotated units away from trouble. He coined honestly and posted accounts. He punished corruption in provinces with a clear hand. Governors learned that the center watched and that exile smelled like dust and shame. He reorganized Italy into regions and set census machines to regular work. He built the Arapaces to celebrate peace, without calling it victory. He paved, drained, and planted. He placed stones that guided feet and laws that guided hands. The city's breath grew deeper. He wrote his own deeds at the end, the res gestae, a list of works rather than boasts. It named gifts, roads, wars, and buildings. It named mercy offered and laws passed. It kept the tone he had learned early, spare, clean, and exact. He knew how memory worked. Anchors held the long arc. Philippi belonged to 42 BCE. Nalocus broke Sextus in 36. Actium settled the main question in 31. Egypt fell in 30. The doors of Janus closed after. Augustus took shape by 27 and set the tone through careful decades. These marks fixed a river that became a sea. He had not created Rome's hunger for one steady hand. He had met it with law and habit. He did not call himself king because words matter. He made the republic's bones hold by giving them new ligaments and by calling them by old names. The result felt familiar and new at once. Caesar's life had tipped the frame. His death had shattered it. Octavian gathered the pieces and built something that held. It held because it fed grain, paid soldiers, and let towns live by calendars that finally matched the sun. It held because the man at the top knew when to stop. The empire did not begin with a trumpet. It began with lists, schedules, and a city too tired to argue long. It grew through roads and garrisons, not through words alone. It carried scars from the years that made it. Those scars guided hands. Rome stood under a new sun that pretended to be the old one, and, for peace, the city allowed the pretense. Streets filled, courts turned, ships unloaded, and farmers planted by dates that did not float. The Tiber smelled of damp rope and confidence. The story returned to ash on rooftops, and a will opened in a quiet room. From that ash, order rose again, different in name, familiar in feel. The Republic faded in law and lived on in forms. The empire spoke softly at first, and then in a steady voice. History kept the names. It kept the bridges over quick rivers and the schedules that held a state. It kept a calendar that matched the sky. It kept a lesson without flourish. Power, once gathered into one hand, rarely spreads back out by itself. Rome learned that once. The world learned it often.